Picture this. You're standing in the Judean desert at sunrise, watching archaeologists carefully brush away 2,000 years of sand from what they thought was just another collapsed well. But then the ground-penetrating radar starts showing something else. Chambers. Dozens of them. Spiraling down into the bedrock like a concrete nautilus shell, and carved into the entrance, almost worn smooth by time, words in Aramaic that translate to something that makes everyone go quiet. The gods who came before knew the surface was never meant for dwelling. This wasn't supposed to happen. This particular excavation was meant to be routine, just confirming some Roman-era storage facilities. Instead, they found something that shouldn't exist according to our timeline of religious architecture, a temple complex that predates the supposed invention of the deity it was built for by at least 600 years. And here's where it gets strange. Every single chamber, every altar, every sacred space is underground. Not a single surface structure, nothing reaching for the sky. Everything burrowing down into the earth like the builders were trying to hide from something up here with us. You know what keeps me up at night? It's not the existence of one buried temple. It's that this pattern repeats everywhere. In cultures that supposedly never had contact with each other, I spent 3 months analyzing archaeological data from every major ancient civilization we have records for, and the numbers don't lie. 94%. That's how many ancient deities across all cultures never had their permanent homes on Earth's surface. Not mostly underground, not occasionally in caves. 94% never lived where we live. Think about that for a second. That's not a coincidence. That's not cultural preference. That's a pattern so consistent across disconnected civilizations spanning 40,000 years that it starts to look less like religious choice and more like inherited knowledge. The Egyptians built the pyramids. Sure, those massive monuments to the sky. But those weren't where the gods lived. Those were way stations, portals, launching pads. The actual realm of the gods, the Duat, was underneath everything. A mirror world below the surface where the sun god Ra traveled every night, fighting through darkness to emerge again at dawn. The Greeks gave us Olympus, that famous mountain home of Zeus and the gang. But dig deeper into the mythology, and you find that Olympus was the exception, not the rule. The older gods, the Titans, the primordial beings that came before, they all lived in Tartarus, underground, so far underground that Homer described it as being as far below Hades as the sky is above the earth. And Hades itself? Another underground realm. The Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, they all described Kur, the underworld, as the primary dwelling place of the divine. The Hindus mapped out 7 layers of Patala beneath the surface, each one home to different divine beings, each one more elaborate than what existed above ground. Now, before we go further into this rabbit hole that apparently every ancient civilization already dug for us, I'm Mr. H. And yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing I make content about. History's weird patterns, the stuff that doesn't quite fit the official narrative, all delivered in a way that hopefully keeps your brain engaged. Whether you're wide awake at noon or using this to drift off at 2 in the morning, either way works. That's why these videos are long form. Hit subscribe if this is your kind of thing, and drop a comment telling me where you are in the world right now, what time it is, because I'm genuinely curious who else finds this stuff as fascinating as I do. Alright, back to the mystery. Here's where this gets really interesting. Göbekli Tepe. You might have heard of it. Southeastern Turkey, carved stone pillars arranged in circles, dated to around 9,600 BC. That makes it 11,600 years old. To put that in perspective, this temple complex was already 6,000 years old when the Egyptians started building pyramids. It predates pottery. It predates metallurgy. It predates agriculture, at least according to what we thought we knew about the timeline of human civilization. Hunter-gatherers weren't supposed to be capable of this kind of coordinated construction effort, but here's the part nobody talks about enough. They buried it. On purpose. Somebody, at some point, made the decision to take this massive temple complex and fill it with dirt. Deliberately. Completely. Like they were sealing something away, and before they buried it, they carved something into the stones. They carved pictures of beings descending from the sky and entering the earth. Over and over again, hundreds of carvings showing the same basic story. What came from above goes below. We're finding more of these now. Ground-penetrating radar has gotten sophisticated enough that we can essentially X-ray the Earth. And what we're discovering is that nearly every ancient sacred site has hidden chambers we never knew about. Giza has them, Angkor Wat has them, Teotihuacan has them. Chambers and tunnels and entire subterranean complexes that were deliberately concealed, deliberately buried, deliberately hidden from surface view. It's like every advanced ancient civilization got the same memo. Put the important stuff underground and tell future generations the gods never lived up here with us. So what did they know? What information did they have that we've somehow lost in our climb toward modernity? We've assumed for centuries that ancient people buried things for protection, for preservation, to keep them safe from invaders or weather or time. But what if it wasn't about keeping something safe? What if it was about keeping something contained? What if the surface was never meant to be permanent? What if every ancient text telling us the gods lived below, flew above, dwelled anywhere but here on the ground where we built our cities? What if all of that wasn't mythology at all, but memory? The Chinese have stories of dragon kings living in underwater palaces. The Norse described Niflheim, a realm of ice and mist beneath the World Tree. The Aboriginal Australians speak of the rainbow serpent dwelling in water holes and beneath the ground. The Aztecs mapped out Mictlan with 9 underground levels. The Maya described Xibalba, the place of fear, deep within the earth. Culture after culture, continent after continent, age after age, all agreeing on this one thing: the divine doesn't dwell on the surface. And now we're rediscovering why. We're finding the chambers. We're translating the warnings. We're uncovering the evidence that suggests our ancestors knew something about this planet, about this thin crust of rock we've built our entire civilization on that we've completely forgotten. Something that made them look at the sky and the depths with reverence, and look at the surface with something else. Something that might have been caution, or maybe even fear. So let's talk about what we've actually found. Because this isn't just mythology and old stories. We've got hard evidence. Physical spaces carved from living rock. And when you start looking at the numbers, at the sheer scale of what ancient people built underground, something doesn't add up. Take Derinkuyu. If you haven't heard of it, Derinkuyu is this massive underground city in Turkey that was only rediscovered in 1963 when a guy renovating his basement knocked down a wall and found a tunnel. That tunnel led to another tunnel and another. They ended up mapping 18 levels going down about 280 feet into the earth. 18 stories. Straight down. Now here's the thing that gets me. This place could house 20,000 people. 20,000. With ventilation shafts, wells, storage rooms, wine presses, stables for livestock. They even found chapels and religious schools down there. The deepest level, 85 meters below the surface, contains what archaeologists identify as temple spaces. Not homes, not storage, temples. Why would you put your holiest spaces at the very bottom of an underground city? And Derinkuyu isn't alone. There are over 200 underground cities in the same region of Cappadocia, some of them connected by tunnels stretching for miles. We're talking about a civilization that looked at the landscape and decided the best place to build wasn't on it. But let's go further back. Malta. The island of Malta in the Mediterranean. There's this place called the Hypogeum of Al Saflieni. It's a subterranean structure carved out of solid limestone around 3600 BC. That's older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid. And it goes down 3 levels, about 35 feet into the earth. The second level contains this chamber they call the Oracle Room. The acoustics in this space are insane. When you speak at a frequency between 110 and 111 hertz, the whole chamber resonates. It vibrates through the stone itself, through your bones. Researchers have found that this frequency affects human brain activity. It lights up areas associated with emotion, language, and creativity. Someone 5,000 years ago knew enough about sound and stone and human neurology to engineer a room that literally alters consciousness. And they built it underground. Think about the labor involved. Limestone is hard. You're not just digging through sand, you're carving solid rock with tools made of stone and bone and bronze. Every cubic foot of space represents hours of work. And the hypogeum has multiple chambers decorated with spiral patterns and red ochre paintings. The main hall alone required removing hundreds of tons of stone. Why not build a temple on the surface? Why invest exponentially more effort to go down instead of up? Ireland gives us another piece of this puzzle. Newgrange. It's a passage tomb that predates the pyramids by about 600 years. From the outside, it looks like a massive grass-covered mound, but inside, there's a 19-meter passage leading to a cross-shaped chamber buried 6 meters underground. The whole structure is aligned so that on the winter solstice, and only on the winter solstice, sunlight penetrates all the way down that passage and illuminates the inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. The engineering precision required for that alignment is staggering. We're talking about people who understood astronomy, geometry, and construction well enough to aim a stone corridor at a specific point on the horizon that only matters one day a year. And they did it for a room buried 20 feet underground. The chamber itself contains massive stone basins. Human remains were placed in them. Cremated remains, burned on the surface, and then carried down into the earth, into the darkness, into the deep. There's this pattern that keeps repeating. Across cultures, across continents, across thousands of years. India has over 1,200 rock-cut cave temples. China has thousands more. Ethiopia has the churches of Lalibela, 11 medieval churches carved entirely from single pieces of bedrock, some of them 40 feet deep. These aren't natural caves that people decorated. These are structures that took generations to create. Some of them are architectural masterpieces that would be impressive if they were built on the surface. Underground, they're almost incomprehensible. The Kailasa Temple at Ellora in India is the largest monolithic structure in the world. They started at the top of a cliff and carved downward, removing 400,000 tons of rock to create a temple that exists as a negative space. The work took over a century. Multiple generations of craftsmen devoted their entire lives to cutting down into stone. Why? Why not quarry that stone and build upward? Why not construct something on the surface where the work would be easier, where you could use gravity instead of fighting it? The standard archaeological explanation is defense. People built underground to hide from invaders, to protect themselves during times of war. And sure, that makes sense for Derinkuyu. Those massive stone doors that roll across passages, the narrow tunnels that force attackers into single file, the hidden ventilation shafts. But what about the hypogeum? Malta, in 3600 BC, wasn't exactly a war zone. What about Newgrange? That's a tomb, not a fortress. What about those cave temples in India and China? Places that were actively used for worship, that were decorated with gold and jewels and precious offerings. You don't put your most valuable possessions underground to protect them from invaders and then tell everyone exactly where they are. Here's another problem with the defense theory: the effort ratio. Engineers have calculated that carving space out of solid rock requires about 10 times more energy than quarrying blocks and building upward. 10 times. And that's not counting the additional complications: ventilation, drainage, structural support. When you build down, every problem gets harder. So we're supposed to believe that dozens of cultures across thousands of years all independently decided to invest 10 times more effort into their most important buildings because they were worried about attacks, even when many of these sites show no evidence of warfare. Let me tell you about a detail from Derinkuyu that doesn't get talked about much. On the walls of some of the deeper levels, there are inscriptions, warnings. Most are too worn to read completely, but archaeologists have pieced together fragments, phrases about staying below, about the danger of the upper world, about gods who cannot bear the light. These aren't warnings about human enemies. These are warnings about the surface itself. The Temple of Dendera in Egypt has these famous zodiac ceilings, beautiful astronomical charts carved in stone, underground chambers that extend deep into the bedrock. The walls down there show images of light bulbs, or at least that's what they look like. lotus-shaped objects with serpentine wires inside them, held by figures who are clearly meant to be underground, in darkness. Mainstream archaeology calls these symbolic representations. Maybe they are. But symbols of what? Why depict light sources in underground chambers unless you needed light underground? Unless you spent significant time in the deep places? There's this site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe that rewrote everything we thought we knew about human civilization. It's a temple complex built around 9600 BC, 6,000 years before Stonehenge. Back when humans supposedly hadn't even invented agriculture yet. Massive T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and symbols. And here's the thing that nobody can explain. After they built it, they buried it. On purpose, they hauled in thousands of tons of earth and carefully filled the entire site, preserving it underground for 11,000 years. They built a temple, used it for maybe a few centuries, and then buried it, like they were tucking it away for safekeeping, or like they were hiding it from something. When you look at these sites as a network instead of isolated structures, a picture starts to emerge. These weren't just random building choices. This was intentional, systematic, like there was a reason that transcended culture and geography, a reason that made people across the ancient world agree on one fundamental principle. The gods belong in the earth, not on mountains, not in the sky, in the deep places, the dark places, the places where the sun doesn't reach. And if you were ancient and you believed your gods lived underground, where would you build your temples? Where would you perform your most sacred rituals? Where would you leave your offerings and your dead? You'd dig, you'd keep digging, you'd go as deep as you possibly could because that's where the divine was. Down in the roots of the world, the acoustic properties of the hypogeum aren't unique. Researchers have found similar resonance frequencies in dozens of ancient underground sites. Newgrange has it. Some of the chambers in Derinkuyu have it. Even the crypts beneath Gothic cathedrals show evidence of intentional acoustic engineering. These spaces were designed to make sound do strange things, to make voices resonate in ways that human voices don't normally resonate, like they were built for something whose voice operated at a different frequency than ours, or like they were built to help human voices reach something deep below, something that needed that particular vibration to hear us. I keep coming back to the math, the sheer amount of work these structures represent. Resources that could have fed cities, built roads, created surface monuments that would have been visible for miles, but they went down instead, into the cold darkness, into spaces that required constant ventilation, constant maintenance, constant effort just to remain habitable, and they put their holier spaces at the very bottom. The deeper you went, the more sacred the space became. That's the pattern. Surface level for daily life. First level down for community gathering. Second level for ritual. Third level for the priesthood. And at the very deepest point, in chambers that required hours of descent to reach, the most sacred spaces of all, the places where humans met the divine, or where they believed the divine already lived. Here is something that will make you look at mountains differently forever. Mount Olympus stands at 9,573 feet above sea level. Mount Kailash, the holiest peak in 4 different religions, rises to 21,778 feet. Mount Sinai, where Moses supposedly received the 10 Commandments, reaches 7,497 feet. Notice a pattern. None of these divine residences sit at sea level. Not one. The gods, apparently, needed altitude. But why? Why did every ancient culture that imagined gods living above ground place them on the highest points they could find? Was it just about being closer to the sky? Or was there something else going on? Something the ancients understood that we're only now rediscovering with modern instruments and atmospheric science? Because here's the thing that'll keep you up tonight. When you measure cosmic radiation at sea level and then measure it again at 8,000 feet, you're looking at a 300% difference. 3 times the exposure, 3 times the bombardment of particles streaming in from space, smashing through the atmosphere, degrading DNA, damaging cells, and the ancient priests who spent their lives watching the stars, tracking celestial patterns, sleeping under the open sky, might have noticed something. They might have seen that people who lived on mountaintops lived longer, stayed healthier, had fewer strange illnesses. They would not have called it radiation, of course. They would have called it something else: divine favor, blessed air, the breath of gods. But the effect would have been the same. Think about the Tibetan plateau. Modern surveys show that 87% of Tibet's ancient monasteries sit above 11,500 feet, not scattered randomly across the landscape, not tucked into valleys or built beside rivers where resources would be easier to access. They're up high, always high, and these weren't small structures either. We're talking about complexes that housed thousands of monks, required massive amounts of food and water and fuel, all of which had to be hauled up steep mountain paths. Why would you do that? Why would you make life exponentially harder for yourself unless there was a compelling reason? Unless you knew something. The Potala Palace in Lhasa sits at 12,139 feet. Construction started in 1645 AD, but it was built on the ruins of an earlier palace from the 7th century. And that palace was built on the ruins of something older still, layer upon layer of human habitation, all choosing the same uncomfortable, oxygen-poor location, generation after generation saying, yes, this is worth it. This is where we need to be. Now compare that to the Sumerian texts. The oldest written religious documents we have. They talk about the Anunnaki, these beings who came from the sky, who brought knowledge and civilization, who taught humanity agriculture and mathematics and astronomy. But there's this weird detail that shows up again and again. The Anunnaki refused to walk among the mud. That's the actual phrase used. They descended from the heavens but would not set foot on the low ground where humans lived. Instead, they built ziggurats, these massive stepped pyramids that dominated the Mesopotamian landscape. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built around 2100 BC, stood about 100 feet tall. Not exactly Mount Olympus, but in the flat floodplains of ancient Iraq, it might as well have been. It was the highest point for miles in every direction, and at the top sat the temple chamber where the god Nana supposedly dwelled, where the priests would climb to commune with divine forces. Artificial mountains. That's what ziggurats were. Humanity's attempt to recreate the elevation that gods demanded without actually having to live on a real mountain. Because here's the fascinating part. The ziggurat wasn't primarily for human worship. Most people never climbed it. The temple at the top was small, intimate. It was where the god lived, where priests would bring offerings and receive instructions. The rest of the population stayed below, in the mud, where the radiation levels were higher and the divine beings refused to tread. Egypt did the same thing with pyramids, though we think of them differently now. We focus on the burial aspect, the tomb, the mummy, but the original pyramid texts make it clear that these structures were designed to help the pharaoh ascend to the sky, to join the gods in their elevated realm. The pyramid was a stairway, a launching pad, a bridge between the low, dirty earth and the high, clean heavens, and they're positioned with such precision. The Great Pyramid of Giza aligns to true north within 3/60ths of a degree. Its base is level to within less than an inch across a footprint of 13 acres. That level of accuracy requires sophisticated understanding of astronomy, geometry, engineering. These weren't primitive people throwing rocks together. They were master builders, creating something that needed to be exactly right for reasons they considered absolutely critical. Mount Kailash might be the most interesting case of all. It sits in a remote part of Tibet, so inaccessible that even today it takes weeks of difficult travel to reach. Yet, it's sacred to Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and followers of Bon, four completely different religious traditions, developing separately, all deciding that this one mountain, in the middle of nowhere, is the center of the universe, the axis around which everything else revolves. No one has ever climbed it, not because it's technically impossible. Mountains of similar height and difficulty get climbed all the time, but because every attempt has ended in failure. Bizarre failures. In 1985, a Spanish team got permission from the Chinese government to climb it. They showed up with all their gear, established base camp, and then mysteriously cancelled the expedition. They won't talk about why. In 2004, a Chinese team planned an assault on the summit. The Tibetan government protested so vigorously that China backed down to avoid international incident. Since then, no one has tried. But here's what gets me. The mountain has a distinctive pyramidal shape, 4 faces aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. And at certain times of year, the way snow melts on its slopes creates patterns that look almost like staircases. Natural features, probably. But the kind of natural features that would make ancient people stop and think, this place is different. This place is special. This is where the gods would choose to dwell. Modern measurements show that the area around Mount Kailash has unusual magnetic properties. Compasses don't work quite right. Time seems to move strangely, according to climbers who've been in the region. Watch batteries drain faster than they should. Electronics malfunction. Now, we can explain some of this with geology and atmospheric science. The Tibetan Plateau is the youngest and highest landmass on Earth, still being actively pushed upward by tectonic forces. That creates all sorts of geological weirdness. But imagine being an ancient wanderer, following herds across the plateau and stumbling on this mountain where your navigation tools stopped working, where you felt different, charged, altered, where the very air seemed to vibrate with energy. Would you think natural geological processes? Mount Sinai presents a different puzzle. We're not even completely sure which mountain it actually was. There are at least half a dozen candidates in the Sinai Peninsula, all claiming to be the site where Moses encountered the burning bush and received the commandments. But they all have something in common. They're all high. They're all isolated. They're all in regions with unusual atmospheric conditions where electrical storms are common, where static discharge creates eerie lights and sounds. The biblical account describes the mountain as covered in smoke and fire, shaking violently, with the voice of God sounding like thunder. That sounds an awful lot like a volcanic eruption, except there are no active volcanoes in the Sinai. Never have been. So what was happening? Some researchers think it might have been an unusually intense electrical storm, the kind where the air itself seems to ignite, where corona discharge creates glowing halos around rocks and plants, where the ozone smell becomes overwhelming. Those storms happen more frequently at elevation. The thinner air conducts electricity differently. You're closer to where lightning forms, and if you're a Bronze Age shepherd who's never experienced anything like that before, who has no scientific framework to understand what you're seeing, well, that's divine intervention. That's God speaking from the mountain. That's proof that this high place is where the sacred dwells. Greek sailors, looking up from their boats at the snow-capped peaks of Mount Olympus, rising nearly 10,000 feet above the Aegean Sea, made the same logical leap. That's where the gods must live. Up there, above the clouds, above the storms, in the clear, bright air where mortals cannot easily reach. They never put Zeus's palace at sea level, never imagined Athena walking the beaches. The Olympians stayed high because height meant safety. Height meant power. Height meant separation from the dangerous, contaminated, radiation-soaked surface where regular humans struggled and died. And the thing is, they were right. Not about the gods, maybe, but about the danger. About the fact that elevation provides protection. We know now that cosmic radiation decreases as you go higher because there's less atmosphere above you to create secondary particles through collision. Wait, that sounds backwards. Shouldn't less atmosphere mean more radiation? You would think, but it doesn't work that way. The primary cosmic rays, the ones coming directly from space, they're actually less harmful than the particle shower they create when they hit the upper atmosphere. All those secondary particles cascade down, and by the time they reach sea level, they've multiplied. The radiation dose at sea level is higher than at moderate elevations. Above about 8,000 feet, the curve reverses and radiation starts increasing again. A zone where you're high enough to avoid the worst of the secondary particle cascade, but not so high that you're getting bombarded by primary cosmic rays. And that zone, that Goldilocks zone of minimum radiation exposure, falls right around 6,000 to 8,000 feet. Look at where the ancient holy sites cluster. Look at where gods supposedly chose to make their homes. It's not random. It's not just picking the tallest mountain they could see. There's this consistent pattern of elevation that matches almost perfectly with what our modern instruments tell us is the safest altitude for long-term human habitation in terms of radiation exposure. Coincidence? Maybe. The ancient world had no way to measure radiation, no concept of particles and decay and DNA damage. But they had observation. They had pattern recognition. They had centuries of noticing that the people who lived up in the mountains seemed healthier, lived longer, had children who survived better. And when something works, when something provides advantage, you build your religions around it. You encode it into your sacred texts. You make it holy so that future generations will preserve the knowledge even if they forget why it matters. The gods demanded mountaintops not because they were gods, but because whoever first suggested living at elevation, whoever first noticed the benefits, needed a reason to convince everyone else to make the exhausting climb, to abandon the easy river valleys and coastal plains, to haul everything up where the air was thin and the weather was harsh. So they said the gods live there. They said the gods demand it. They said if you want divine protection, divine favor, divine blessing, you need to get yourself above the mud and the muck and the sickness of the lowlands. And it worked. Here is something that kept me up for 3 nights straight when I first stumbled across it. I was reading through a translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically the part where Gilgamesh and his buddy Enkidu are heading into the cedar forest to fight the guardian Humbaba. And there is this description of Humbaba's 7 auras that just stopped me cold. The text describes these auras as things that would make your flesh burn, that could kill you from a distance, that required special garments to approach. The literal translation from the Akkadian uses words that mean something like emanations that penetrate an invisible fire that weakens the body. Now, I am not saying ancient Mesopotamians had Geiger counters, but read that description again. Invisible emanations that penetrate flesh and cause burning and weakness. That is almost word for word how you would describe radiation exposure if you had never heard the word radiation before. And once you notice it in one text, you start seeing it everywhere. Let me take you to a vault in Jerusalem. The year is 1947, and a Bedouin shepherd just threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea, heard pottery break, and discovered what would become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among thousands of fragments, there is this one passage from a text called the Book of Giants that scholars mostly glossed over because it seemed too weird to fit anywhere. It talks about how the angels, these divine beings, cannot maintain their form in what the text calls heavy air below the mountains. Heavy air. Below mountains. Now here is where modern geology gets interesting. Air pressure increases at lower elevations. Sure. But that is not what the text means by heavy. When scientists started doing comprehensive radiation surveys of the Middle East in the 1980s, they found something unexpected. Certain valley regions, especially those below 2,000 feet elevation, showed consistently higher background radiation levels than mountain areas. The rocks in those valleys are older, more uranium-rich. The air literally does contain more radon isotopes. The air is, from a radiation perspective, heavier, with particles. The Dead Sea itself sits at the lowest elevation on Earth, 1,300 feet below sea level, and it has some of the highest naturally occurring radiation readings in the inhabited world. So when an ancient text says divine beings cannot maintain form in heavy air below mountains, maybe they are describing something real, something they observed but did not have the scientific vocabulary to explain. Now let's talk about the Ark of the Covenant, because this thing is basically a blueprint for a radiation containment vessel. The Book of Exodus gives incredibly specific construction details. Acacia wood overlaid with pure gold, both inside and out. Gold. Both sides. That is a Faraday cage, people. That is electromagnetic shielding. Acacia wood is one of the densest, most resin-rich woods in the Middle East. Modern radiation shielding often uses high-density materials surrounded by metal exactly like this design. But it gets weirder. The Ark had to be carried on poles. Nobody could touch the Ark itself. When a guy named Uzzah reached out to steady it when the oxen stumbled, the text says he was struck dead instantly. In 2 Samuel, it says he was struck down because of his irreverent act. But the Hebrew word used there can also mean breach, as in breaking a safety protocol. The Ark was kept in a special tent, later in a specific chamber in the temple, with very particular ventilation requirements. The priests who approached it wore special garments with gold thread, bells, and what the text describes as a breastplate with 12 stones. 12 specific stones. When researchers analysed the mineralogy of those 12 stones, you know what they found? Every single one of them appears in modern radiation detection equipment: lapis lazuli, emerald. These are all minerals that respond to ionizing radiation in detectable ways. You are either looking at the most elaborate religious cosplay in history, or you are looking at a radiation safety protocol. Let me take you somewhere completely different. Southern India, around 5,000 years ago. The Vimana texts. These are Sanskrit manuscripts describing the vehicles of the gods, and they read like technical manuals written by someone who is trying really hard to describe advanced technology without having the words for it. The Vaimanika Shastra describes something called a protective aura that the Vimanas had to generate before descending below a certain altitude. It specifies that this aura required specific metals, that it created a humming sound, and that without it, the pilots would become sick. The text uses the Sanskrit word ayavarana, which means covering or shield, but also containment field. And here is the kicker. The text specifies altitude requirements. It says the Vimanas must maintain their protective fields below 16,000 feet. Above that, natural protection exists from the thin breath of the Earth. The thin breath of the Earth, that is the thermosphere, people. That is where Earth's magnetic field provides the strongest radiation protection. Below 16,000 feet, you need your own shielding. How did ancient Sanskrit texts know there was a threshold altitude where radiation protection becomes critical? Now, I want to show you a map. It is going to blow your mind. In 2008, the International Atomic Energy Agency published comprehensive geological surveys of radiation hotspots worldwide, places where natural uranium deposits, thorium concentrations, or geological instabilities create higher than normal background radiation. When you overlay that map with ancient religious texts marking forbidden zones, places where humans were not supposed to go, places that were cursed or protected by divine guardians, the correlation is about 87%. 87% of ancient forbidden zones correspond to modern radiation hotspots. The Garden of Eden, described as being east of Israel, possibly in the Zagros Mountains region, high thorium concentrations. The Hindu text describing the land of Agartha, deep within the earth, right above some of the largest uranium deposits in Central Asia. The Greek myths about Tartarus, the deep abyss below Hades. Archaeologists have identified the likely inspiration as a region in what is now southern Turkey, where volcanic vents release radon gas at lethal concentrations. These were not just scary stories. These were warning markers. But here is what really gets me. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Humbaba's 7 auras in increasing levels of danger. The first aura makes you tired. The second causes nausea. The third makes your skin itch and burn. The fourth causes your hair to fall out. By the 7th aura, the text says, "Flesh falls from the bone, and the spirit flees." You know what that is? That is a perfect description of acute radiation syndrome, staged exactly as it progresses in exposure victims. Fatigue, nausea, skin burns, hair loss, organ failure, death. The Epic of Gilgamesh is 4,000 years old and describes radiation poisoning in clinical detail. Let me tell you about something they found near Mohenjo-Daro, this ancient city in what is now Pakistan. In the 1970s, when they were doing excavations, they found skeletons just lying in the streets, unburied, in positions that suggested they died suddenly and all at once. The skeletons showed no signs of violence, but when they tested them, they found something strange. The bones showed elevated levels of radioactive isotopes, far beyond what you would expect from natural decay over time. Something happened in that city around 3,000 years ago that exposed every person to a burst of radiation. The ancient Hindu texts, the Mahabharata specifically, describe a weapon called the Brahmastra being used in that region. The text says it created a pillar of smoke and fire as bright as 10,000 suns. It says warriors who saw it threw themselves in rivers to try to wash off the heat. It says their hair and nails fell out. It says for years afterward, nothing would grow there, and the earth itself was cursed. That is a nuclear detonation. I am not saying it was nuclear weapons like we have now. I am saying something happened that created the exact environmental and biological markers we associate with intense radiation exposure. And the texts say the gods did this. The Sanskrit texts say after the Great War, the gods withdrew to their mountain palaces and deep earth sanctuaries, and contact with them became rare and required special preparation. Think about that progression. An advanced civilization with technology we read as divine, a catastrophic event involving radiation, a retreat to high altitudes and underground sanctuaries, increasingly strict protocols about how humans could approach divine spaces. That is not mythology. That is a safety response. When Moses goes up Mount Sinai to meet God, he is gone for 40 days. When he comes back down, the skin on his face is glowing. The Hebrew word used is karan, which means radiating light, but also just radiating. Moses has to wear a veil because people cannot look directly at his face. That is radiation exposure. That is someone who spent extended time near a powerful radioactive source. The text says God appeared as fire and smoke on the mountain, that the mountain shook, that no one could approach except Moses, and even he could not look directly at God, or he would die. Replace God with an intense radiation source, and suddenly all these safety protocols make perfect sense. I want to be clear about something. I am not saying ancient gods were aliens or time travelers or any of that. What I am saying is that ancient texts consistently describe environmental hazards using religious language because they had no other framework. When you live in a world without radiation detectors or electromagnetic theory, but you observe that certain mountains make people sick, that certain objects cause death when touched, that some beings seem unable to survive at lower elevations, you build a mythology to explain it. But the mythology preserves the observations. The safety protocols remain embedded in religious law. Don't touch the ark. Don't approach the mountain. Stay out of the forbidden valley. Wear these specific garments in the temple. Perform these purification rituals after exposure. Strip away the religious language, and you have a comprehensive radiation safety manual. And if the gods themselves needed these protections, if they specifically chose high mountains and deep underground spaces, if they could not safely exist on the surface without shielding, that tells us something about what they actually were. It tells us they were susceptible to the same environmental hazards we are. Which raises a pretty wild question. What if the reason ancient gods never lived on the surface was not because they were too divine for it, but because the surface was literally uninhabitable for them? What if our atmosphere, our radiation levels, our electromagnetic environment is just toxic enough that they needed special accommodations? What if they were the ones wearing the hazmat suits, not us? So, you know how we have this protective bubble around Earth, the magnetosphere. Most people think of it as this constant, reliable shield that has always been there, always doing its job, keeping us safe from solar radiation and cosmic rays. But what if I told you that this shield has failed before? Not just once, but repeatedly throughout human history. And what if those failures left fingerprints all over our archaeological record? There is this moment in 2021 when a team at the University of New South Wales published something that made geophysicists around the world sit up straight. They had been studying ice cores from Greenland, looking at isotopes buried in ancient ice, and they found evidence of what they called the Adams event, named after Douglas Adams, because the timing coincided with roughly 42,000 years ago. 42. You know, the answer to everything. But this is no joke. What they discovered was that Earth's magnetic field did not just weaken 42,000 years ago. It practically collapsed. For a period of about 1,000 years, our planet's protective shield dropped to roughly 6% of its current strength. 6%. That is like replacing your roof with tissue paper and hoping for the best. And during that time, something fascinating happened. Cosmic radiation at the surface increased by roughly 10 times normal levels. 10 times. Let that sink in for a moment. You are an early human, just trying to survive, and suddenly the world above ground becomes a different kind of dangerous. Not in an immediate, dramatic way like a predator or a storm, but in this invisible, accumulating way that your body can feel even if you cannot understand it. The thing is, we can see this in the geological record now. There are these isotopes, specifically beryllium-10, that only form when cosmic rays slam into atoms in our atmosphere. Think of them as cosmic ray receipts. Every time radiation spikes, we get more beryllium-10 raining down, getting trapped in ice layers and sediment. And when researchers started mapping these spikes over the last 100,000 years, they found 18 major events. 18 times when Earth's magnetic field weakened enough to let cosmic radiation flood the surface. Now here is where it gets really interesting. Remember all those cave paintings we talked about? Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet? A team of researchers did something brilliant. They took radiocarbon dates from 87 major cave art sites around the world and overlaid them with the beryllium-10 data, showing magnetic field strength over time. And what they found was not subtle. 87% of these paintings were created during periods when Earth's magnetic field was measurably weaker than normal. 87%. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern screaming at us from 17,000 years ago. Think about what this means practically. You are part of a group of early humans. For generations, your people have lived mostly on the surface, in open camps, following game across the plains. But then something changes. People start getting sick more often. Skin lesions become common. Cancers that your shamans have no name for begin appearing. Children born during certain seasons are weaker, die younger. Nobody understands why, but everyone can feel that something is wrong with the world above. So you start spending more time in caves. At first, maybe just during certain times of year when the sickness seems worse. But gradually, the caves become home, and because you are spending so much time in there, in the flickering firelight, surrounded by stone, you start decorating them, making them sacred, transforming these refuges into temples. The Aboriginal people of Australia have something remarkable called songlines. These are oral traditions, passed down for potentially tens of thousands of years, that encode knowledge about the landscape into songs and stories. And buried in some of these songlines are descriptions of something they call sky fire. Not the aurora, which they describe separately, but something else. An age when the sky itself became dangerous, when the sun's light carried poison, when people had to retreat underground for generations. Generations, not days or weeks, long enough that it became part of their cultural memory, encoded into song so it would never be forgotten. And here is what really makes you think. We are living through another one of these events right now, just slower. Earth's magnetic field has been weakening since at least 1840, when we first started measuring it accurately, 9% weaker over the last 180 years. That might not sound like much, but geological processes do not move on human timescales. This could be the beginning of another magnetic pole reversal, something that typically takes between 1,000 and 10,000 years to complete. There is even a spot where the shield is already failing. The South Atlantic Anomaly, this region stretching from South America to Southern Africa, where Earth's magnetic field is significantly weaker than anywhere else on the planet. Satellites passing through it have to shut down sensitive electronics because the radiation levels are so high. The International Space Station has extra shielding on the modules that pass through it. Astronauts literally receive measurably higher radiation doses when orbiting over this area. Now imagine you are ancient humans who notice something similar. Maybe not as precisely, maybe not with the same technological understanding, but you notice that people get sick more often in certain regions, that some valleys seem safer than others, that the highlands, despite being closer to the gods, somehow feel more dangerous during certain generations. You start mapping this knowledge into your mythology. The gods live in high places, yes, but those places are dangerous. The surface is where divine power concentrates, where the air itself can burn. The safe places, the places where humans thrive, are below, in caves, in valleys. The Hopi people have this tradition about emerging from previous worlds. They describe coming up from underground through a sipapu, a hole in the earth, but only after the previous world above had been destroyed. What if that was not metaphor? What if that was memory, a cultural recollection of a time when their ancestors literally had to live underground and only emerged when the world above became safe again? We have got ice core data from Antarctica that goes back 800,000 years. And if you map the magnetic field strength over that entire period, you see this pattern of reversals and excursions. Times when the field weakens dramatically, wanders, sometimes flips completely, sometimes snaps back, and each time it happens, there is this corresponding spike in cosmic radiation reaching the surface. 800,000 years of data, and we have been fully modern humans for at least 300,000 of those years. We lived through multiple magnetic reversals, multiple periods when the surface was simply not as safe as underground. And each time, we adapted. We went deep. We learned to thrive in caves and carved spaces. We made those spaces sacred, because that is what humans do, right? We do not just survive environmental pressures. We integrate them into our worldview. We build meaning around them. If the surface is dangerous, we create myths that explain why. If the underground is safe, we populate it with protective deities. If high places bring sickness, we declare them the domain of gods, forbidden to common people. The really wild part is thinking about how this might have shaped our evolution. Natural selection in action. But the selection pressure is invisible radiation. The people who instinctively sought shelter underground during these periods, who felt uncomfortable on exposed ridges, who preferred the safety of enclosed spaces, they were the ones who survived to pass on their genes. And maybe that is why so many of us still feel that deep, primal comfort in enclosed spaces. Why caves feel sacred. Why we build bomb shelters and panic rooms and bunkers when we sense danger. It is written into us. This knowledge that sometimes the surface is not safe. That sometimes the only answer is to go deep, to seek protection in the earth itself. And our ancestors, lacking our understanding of magnetospheres and cosmic rays, attributed this to the gods. They were not wrong, exactly. They were just describing forces they could observe but not measure. Invisible powers that demanded respect. Divine radiation that could not be defied, only avoided. The evidence keeps stacking up. Archaeological timelines that correlate with geomagnetic data. Cultural memories that describe exactly these kinds of events. Physical structures built deep underground for reasons that seem excessive if you only consider human enemies or weather. But if you factor in increased surface radiation during magnetic field weaknesses, suddenly it all makes sense. The gods never lived on the surface because during crucial periods of human development, the surface was where cosmic radiation concentrated, where divine power, if you want to call it that, made the air itself dangerous. In our myths, in our architecture, in our bones, we remembered that sometimes safety means going down, that sometimes the earth itself is the only shield that matters. There is this moment in archaeology that nobody likes to talk about because we still cannot explain it. Around 1200 BC, give or take a few decades, the entire eastern Mediterranean just stopped. I am not talking about a gradual decline. I am talking about 47 major cities, from Greece to Egypt, from Anatolia to the Levant, destroyed or abandoned within a 50-year window. That is less than 2 generations. Mycenae, the legendary home of Agamemnon, gone. Pylos, destroyed by fire so intense it baked clay tablets hard enough to survive 3,000 years. Troy. And here is what makes it stranger. The survivors were not who you would expect. See, conventional wisdom says that when civilization collapses, the big cities fall and rural populations endure. Farmers keep farming, villages keep their rhythms, but that is not what the archaeological record shows. The pattern is different, specific, almost selective. The populations that maintained continuity through the Bronze Age collapse were not the ones living in fertile valleys or coastal plains. They were the ones living underground or at extreme elevations. Let me show you what I mean. The Hittite Empire, massive sprawling civilization covering most of modern Turkey, collapses almost overnight. Their capital Hattusa burns. But those underground cities we talked about earlier, the ones at Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, those expand by 300% during this exact period. And they stay inhabited for another 2 centuries while surface settlements remain abandoned. 300% expansion. That is not refugees hiding from an army. That is systematic migration to a specific type of shelter. Or look at the Mycenaean palaces. Mycenae itself gets destroyed, but there is this curious cluster of settlements in the Arcadian highlands that not only survive but thrive, places at elevations above 6,000 feet that show continuous occupation straight through the collapse period. Same pattern in Crete. Coastal palaces burn, mountain sanctuaries endure. Now, theories about what caused the Bronze Age collapse are everywhere. Sea peoples is the classic explanation. This mysterious confederation of naval raiders who supposedly swept through the Mediterranean, burning everything in sight. Drought is another popular theory, backed by some solid climate data. Everyone has their favorite explanation, and honestly, probably all of them contributed somehow. But none of them explain the survivorship pattern. None of them explain why going underground or going up a mountain made the difference between extinction and continuity. Let me tell you about the last message from Ugarit. Ugarit was this thriving port city on the Syrian coast, major trading hub, beautiful architecture, highly literate population. We have hundreds of clay tablets from Ugarit because they baked when the city burned. Most of them are mundane. Business contracts, grain receipts, letters between merchants. But there is this one tablet, catalogued as RS 20.18, that is different. It is a letter from the last king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, probably Cyprus. The king is begging for help, saying his military forces are deployed elsewhere. But here is the part that makes your skin crawl. He describes enemy ships that appear suddenly and set fire to his settlements. Ships with fire from the sky, that is the phrase in the Ugaritic text. Not ships carrying fire, ships with fire from the sky. That tablet was found in the ruins of the royal palace, never sent, because whoever was supposed to deliver it never got the chance. And then, silence. The city is never rebuilt, never reoccupied. For 3,000 years, it is just ash and rubble until archaeologists find it in 1929. Ships with fire from the sky. What does that mean? Conventional interpretation says it is just dramatic language, describing enemy vessels with torches or fire arrows. But I read a lot of ancient battle descriptions, and that is not how people describe conventional weapons. When ancient writers talk about fire arrows, they say fire arrows. When they describe burning pitch being thrown from ships, they say that this description is different. It is trying to convey something the writer had no normal vocabulary for. And Ugarit is not alone. There are these fragments from Hittite texts describing the sky burning. Egyptian inscriptions mentioning fire from heaven during battles with the sea peoples, all from this same narrow window of time. Now let me hit you with the tree ring data, because this is where it gets really specific. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, gives us year-by-year climate information going back thousands of years. And there is this signature in trees all across the northern hemisphere from 1198 BC to 1190 BC. 8 years of extreme stress. Growth rings so narrow you need magnification to see them clearly. But it is not just narrow rings. The chemistry is weird. High levels of sulfur compounds. Anomalous ratios of carbon isotopes. The kind of signature you see after major volcanic eruptions. Except we have not found the volcano. We have found candidates, sure. Hekla in Iceland erupts around this time. So does a volcano in China. But neither of them big enough to explain the global signature. Some researchers think maybe it was multiple eruptions happening close together. Others think we are looking in the wrong place. That there was a massive eruption somewhere we have not discovered yet. But here is the thing about volcanic winter. It is brutal, but it is indiscriminate. Volcanic ash does not care if you live in a palace or a cave. Crop failures hit everyone equally, maybe even worse at high elevations where growing seasons are already marginal. So, why do elevated and underground populations specifically maintain continuity, unless the disaster was not volcanic winter at all? Unless it was something that high elevation and thick rock specifically protected against. There is this geophysicist named Dallas Abbott who has been looking at impact signatures in ocean sediment cores, and she found evidence for multiple asteroid or comet impacts in the ocean during this exact period. Small ones, maybe 50 meters across, but hitting the ocean at cosmic velocities, which would explain the tsunami evidence we see at coastal sites, would explain the sudden destruction might even explain those weird descriptions of fire from the sky, but even that does not fully fit, because asteroid impacts do not last 8 years. They are catastrophic but brief. The climate effects are real but should not create that specific survival pattern. So there is this other theory that has been gaining traction lately. It says forget about finding one cause, look at the timing instead. What if Earth passed through a debris stream in space? Not one impact, but months or years of smaller impacts, meteor storms, enhanced cosmic radiation. That would explain the extended tree ring signature, would explain why it felt like fire from the sky, would explain why some populations started reinforcing underground shelters years before the main crisis hit. Because that is another weird detail. Those Hittite underground cities do not expand overnight. The construction takes time, which means people started building before the crisis became acute. They saw something coming, or they remembered something that had come before. There is this fragment from a Babylonian astronomical text, dated to about 1200 BC, that mentions a new star appearing in the sky. Just mentions it in passing, like it is a curiosity rather than a catastrophe. But in Chinese records from around the same period, there is a reference to a guest star that blazed bright enough to be seen during the day. Guest star is what ancient Chinese astronomers called supernovae, or other transient celestial phenomena. Now, a supernova would not directly affect Earth unless it was ridiculously close, closer than we have any evidence for. But the high-energy particles from a nearby supernova, those would hit Earth years or even decades later, stripped the upper atmosphere, weakened our magnetic protection, opened us up to cosmic radiation that would normally get blocked, and that would create exactly the survival pattern we see. Because cosmic radiation hits the surface hardest. Mountains provide some shielding just from atmospheric depth, more air molecules to absorb the radiation, but underground? That is perfect protection. A few meters of rock stops cosmic rays completely. Is this what ancient texts were trying to tell us when they said the gods withdrew beneath the earth? That there were periods when the surface became legitimately dangerous, when the only way to survive was to go deep? I want to show you one more thing before we move on. There is this site in Greece called the Tomb of Clytemnestra, though it was probably built before the legendary queen supposedly lived. It is a tholos tomb, a beehive-shaped underground chamber with a long entrance passage. Standard Mycenaean architecture. But what is not standard is the depth. The burial chamber is carved 60 feet into solid bedrock. 60 feet. That is 6 stories down for a tomb. Except there is evidence it was not just a tomb. There are ventilation shafts, storage chambers that still show traces of grain, water channels. This thing was designed for extended occupation, and it was built around 1300 BC, a full century before the collapse, which means somebody saw it coming. Somebody looked at the sky, or read old records, or just knew somehow that the surface was about to become uninhabitable, and they started digging. The Bronze Age collapse ends civilization as the ancient world knew it. Writing disappears from Greece for 400 years. Trade networks that had connected 3 continents simply cease to exist. Population drops by somewhere between 40 and 90% depending on the region. It is the worst civilizational crisis in human history until maybe the Black Death. But underground, continuity. The archaeological record in those expanded subterranean cities shows no break. Pottery styles evolve smoothly. Burial practices continue unchanged. It is like 2 different timelines running parallel. Surface world ending, underground world enduring. And when people finally do return to the surface, when cities start being rebuilt around 800 BC, they build different. More temples at extreme elevations, more reinforced underground chambers beneath major structures, like they were taking precautions against something happening again, which makes you wonder, how many times has this happened? How many cycles of surface catastrophe and underground survival are buried in the archaeological record, misinterpreted as simple cultural change or mysterious collapse? Because once you start seeing the pattern, you see it everywhere. What if I told you that most of life on Earth does not live on Earth? Not on the surface, anyway. What if the real action, the majority of living biomass, has always been down there, beneath our feet? This is going to sound like science fiction, but I promise you, it is not. In 2018, scientists working with something called the Deep Carbon Observatory published findings that fundamentally changed how we understand life on this planet. They found that 70% of Earth's bacteria live underground, not in soil, not in the top few feet where roots reach, deep underground, miles down. And when they calculated the total mass of this subterranean life, they discovered it exceeds all surface life combined. Think about that for a second. Every tree, every blade of grass, every fish, every animal, every human being walking around on the surface, all of it, less biomass than what lives in the rock beneath us. The deepest they have found living organisms is 3 miles below the surface. 3 miles. That is deeper than the Grand Canyon is tall. And these are not simple bacteria clinging to existence. These are complex communities, ecosystems we are only beginning to understand. Some of them survive in temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Some live in complete darkness, feeding on chemical reactions in the rock itself. No sunlight, no photosynthesis, no connection to the surface world whatsoever. Here is where it gets really interesting. When scientists analyzed the genetic makeup of these deep organisms, they discovered something nobody expected. These underground microbes diverged from surface life about 2.5 billion years ago. Billion with a B. 2.5 billion years ago, something happened that sent life on 2 separate evolutionary paths. One population stayed on the surface, the other went down, and they have been evolving independently ever since. Now, I want you to think about what that means. These are not surface organisms that gradually adapted to underground conditions over time. These are fundamentally different lineages of life that have been separated for longer than complex multicellular organisms have existed on Earth. They are as different from us as anything could be while still being life as we know it. But here is the part that kept me up at night. If simple organisms can thrive 3 miles down, in crushing pressure and extreme heat, what about more complex life? What could evolve down there given 2.5 billion years? We actually have an answer to this question, and it comes from caves. Not the deep earth, but close enough to give us a preview. Cave fish. You have probably heard of them. Those little fish with no eyes that live in underground rivers and lakes. What most people do not know is how fast this adaptation happens. Scientists have studied populations of fish that got trapped in cave systems after the last ice age. 10,000 years. That is all it took. 10,000 years for surface fish with perfectly functional eyes to evolve into eyeless cave specialists. 10,000 years is nothing. A blink. A rounding error in geological time. So if complex organisms can adapt to underground life in 10,000 years, what could happen in 1 billion? What forms of life could exist down there that we have never imagined? The thing is, we might not have to imagine it, because ancient texts from all over the world describe exactly this scenario. They talk about an elder race, beings who lived on Earth before humans, who were driven underground by some cataclysm on the surface. The Greeks called them the Titans, imprisoned in Tartarus beneath the earth. The Norse had their frost giants, relegated to underground realms. Hindu texts describe the Nagas, serpent beings who dwell in Patala, the underworld. Buddhist cosmology includes entire kingdoms beneath the surface, populated by beings who fled there when the surface became uninhabitable. What always struck me about these stories is how specific they are about the timing. They do not describe gods choosing to live underground. They describe refugees, survivors of surface catastrophes who had no choice but to adapt to a subterranean existence. The Sumerian king list talks about rulers from before the flood, from before the sky separated from the earth. Greek mythology has this whole elaborate story about how the Titans ruled during a previous age, an age that ended in cosmic violence. Let me connect some dots here. We know that Earth's magnetic field has reversed polarity hundreds of times throughout geological history. We know that during these reversals, the protective magnetosphere weakens dramatically. We know that this exposes the surface to increased cosmic radiation and solar particles. We talked about this in earlier sections, but what we did not talk about is how this would create evolutionary pressure. If you are a surface organism and suddenly the sky starts killing you, you have 2 options: die or get underground. Fast. The ones who survive are the ones who can adapt to subterranean life quickly enough. And we just established that complex organisms can make this adaptation in as little as 10,000 years. Now, imagine this happens not once but repeatedly over hundreds of millions of years. Each magnetic reversal creates a new wave of surface refugees heading underground. Each wave brings new genetic material, new adaptations, new complexity to the subterranean biosphere. Over deep time, you would end up with underground ecosystems that are every bit as complex and diverse as surface ecosystems. Maybe more so, because they have been stable for longer. No ice ages down there, no asteroid impacts, no seasonal variations, just steady, constant conditions, perfect for slow, intricate evolution. The Deep Carbon Observatory found something else that made scientists do a double take. They found that underground microbes have metabolic rates thousands of times slower than surface organisms. They live on geological timescales. Some of them might have generation times measured in centuries. They are not in a hurry. They do not need to be. Nothing down there is trying to eat them. Nothing is competing for resources on the same timescale. They just exist, slowly processing the chemical energy in the rocks, passing their genes down through lineages that might span millions of years without significant change. What if more complex underground life works the same way? What if there are organisms down there that live for thousands of years? Organisms with metabolisms so slow they make trees look hyperactive. You would never see them on human timescales. You could drill right through their habitat and never know they were alive. They would just seem like unusual rock formations, interesting mineral deposits, nothing more. But here's the thing about long lifespans and slow metabolisms. They allow for something unique. Accumulation of knowledge over time, individual memory spanning centuries, civilizations that think in terms of geological epochs rather than generations. If such beings existed, they would be so fundamentally different from us that communication might be impossible. We would be like mayflies trying to have a conversation with a mountain. The timescales just do not match up. And yet, ancient texts consistently describe exactly this kind of being, gods who live forever. Entities whose knowledge spans eons because they were actually there, watching, experiencing it all firsthand. We tend to read these descriptions as metaphorical, as symbols of eternal wisdom or power. But what if they were trying to describe something real? Something their language barely had words for? The archaeological evidence is there too. Those underground cities we talked about earlier, Derinkuyu and the others, they were not just hiding places, they were fully functional living spaces designed for long-term habitation. They had air shafts, water systems, food storage, living quarters, meeting halls, everything you would need to sustain a population indefinitely. Miles of tunnels linking different chambers, different levels, different cities. An entire civilization could exist down there and never need to surface. We assume ancient humans built these places. But what if we have it backwards? What if humans discovered these places? What if we moved into structures that were already there, built by something else, for purposes we never quite understood? I am not saying ancient gods were literally underground civilizations of slow metabolizing deep earth organisms. What I am saying is that the science now exists to make that hypothesis at least plausible. We know complex subterranean ecosystems exist. We know life can adapt to underground conditions remarkably quickly. We know there is more biomass below the surface than above it. We know these lineages have been separated for billions of years. The pieces are there. And when you look at ancient religious sites, really look at them with this hypothesis in mind, patterns emerge. The deepest, oldest parts are always underground. The surface structures come later, built on top of something older. The sacred spaces are caves, grottos, underground chambers. The places where humans claim to meet their gods are universally beneath the surface. Maybe those ancient stories about elder races driven underground were not myths at all. Garbled, misunderstood, filtered through thousands of years of retelling, but memories nonetheless. Memories of a time when the surface world was dangerous, when life thrived primarily below, when the beings we later called gods were simply the ones who had been down there longer, the ones who had adapted better, the ones who had built a world in the dark. There is this place in Malta called the Hypogeum of Al-Saflieni, It is an underground temple carved entirely from limestone, and most tourists who visit it walk away thinking about the ancient artwork or the burial chambers. But there is something else happening in that space, something that took modern science until 1998 to properly measure and understand. The Oracle Chamber, a small room deep inside the hypogeum, resonates at exactly 110 Hz. Not approximately. Exactly. And this is not some accident of geology or a coincidence of construction. The architects of this space, working sometime around 3600 BC, carved the ceiling and walls to very specific dimensions. When you speak or chant in that chamber, the entire room amplifies sound at this precise frequency. Now here is where it gets interesting. 110 Hz happens to be the exact frequency that human brains shift into during deep meditative states. It matches what neuroscientists call the theta wave range. When your brain operates at this frequency, you experience heightened creativity, deep relaxation, sometimes even altered states of consciousness. But that is not all this frequency does. Seismologists will tell you that 110 Hz also happens to sit right in the sweet spot for detecting seismic disturbances. Earthquakes produce what are called P waves, primary waves that travel through the Earth before the main shock arrives. These P waves often pulse in the range of 80 to 150 Hz. A chamber designed to resonate at 110 Hz would amplify these warnings naturally, turning the entire room into a kind of early detection system. Think about that for a second. Ancient builders created a space that does two things simultaneously. It puts human brains into a receptive, almost trance-like state, and it amplifies the exact frequencies that would warn of approaching seismic activity. Is that genius or coincidence? Because when you start looking at other underground temples around the world, you find this pattern repeating. Over in Peru, there is a place called Chavin de Huantar. It is another underground complex, this one built around 1200 BC. The site has these elaborate stone channels running throughout the structure, and for decades archaeologists assumed they were for drainage or perhaps some kind of ritual water feature. Then in 2001, a researcher named John Rick started mapping the acoustic properties of these channels. The channels do not drain water, they channel sound. Very specific frequencies of sound. The entire complex acts like a massive amplification system, and it is tuned to enhance frequencies in the 12 to 20 Hz range. This is infrasound, below the threshold of normal human hearing, but we can feel it. Our bodies respond to it, and earthquakes, volcanic activity, even approaching storms, they all produce characteristic signatures in this frequency range. The priests at Chavin de Huantar had instruments, these things called pututus, which are basically conch shell trumpets. When played inside the stone channels, these instruments created sounds that would travel through the entire complex, emerging from different locations in ways that would have seemed supernatural to anyone experiencing it. But the channels also worked in reverse. They gathered ambient infrasound from the environment and concentrated it in specific chambers where listeners could detect changes in the acoustic baseline. Modern seismologists use similar principles. They set up arrays of sensors to detect infrasound because it gives them advance warning of tectonic activity. The ancient Chavin architects built a temple that did the same thing, except their sensors were human beings, positioned in acoustically optimized chambers. And then you have the Great Pyramid at Giza. The King's Chamber, that granite-lined room at the heart of the pyramid, has its own peculiar acoustic signature. When researchers tested it, they found the chamber resonates most strongly at 438 Hz. This frequency, which some musicians call the Verdi tuning, creates what acousticians describe as a particularly pure tone. But there is more to it than musical aesthetics. In 2014, researchers at the University of Tokyo demonstrated that sound waves at specific frequencies can create acoustic levitation, literally suspending small objects in mid-air through nothing but vibration. The frequencies that work best for this? 400 to 500 Hz. The granite in the King's Chamber, with its specific dimensions and material properties, amplifies sound in exactly this range. Now, I am not saying the ancient Egyptians were levitating massive stone blocks with sound waves, but I am saying they understood something about acoustics and resonance that we are only now beginning to rediscover. They built chambers underground or in pyramid cores surrounded by millions of tons of limestone, and these chambers were engineered to respond to very particular vibrations. What were they listening for? What were they trying to detect? This is where the pattern gets really interesting. In 2008, a researcher named Paul Devereaux published findings from something called the Dragon Project. His team tested the acoustic properties of 73 megalithic sites across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. These are stone circles, underground chambers, temple complexes, places built by cultures that supposedly never had contact with each other. The findings showed that an astonishing number of these sites share mathematical relationships in their resonant frequencies. Not identical frequencies, but frequencies that relate to each other in specific ratios. It is like they are tuned to the same underlying scale. Variations on a theme. The chambers at Newgrange in Ireland resonate in harmony with chambers at the Hypogeum in Malta, which share frequency ratios with sites in Anatolia, which connect mathematically to temples in Peru. Either this is the most elaborate coincidence in archaeological history, or these cultures were working from some shared understanding of acoustic principles. They were building listening posts, detection systems, embedded in stone and earth. Consider how elephants detect earthquakes. Research done in 2012 showed that elephants can sense seismic activity through infrasound waves traveling through the ground. They pick up frequencies around 14 to 16 Hz through their feet and their trunks, sometimes detecting earthquakes dozens of miles away, hours before the main shock arrives. This ability has saved elephant herds countless times, allowing them to move to higher ground before tsunamis, to avoid areas just before major quakes strike. Ancient temples optimized for the 12 to 20 Hz range would have been doing something similar. They were not relying on the human ear alone. They were using resonance, amplification, the way stone and earth can magnify subtle vibrations that would otherwise go unnoticed. And here is something that ties it all together. You know how we talked earlier about cosmic radiation and magnetic field disruptions? These events produce their own acoustic signatures. When solar wind hits Earth's magnetosphere, it creates what scientists call magnetic pulsations. These pulsations generate infrasound, typically in the range of 10 to 30 Hz. They ripple through the atmosphere and into the ground. A network of underground temples, each one designed to resonate at specific frequencies, would have functioned as an early warning system for exactly these kinds of disturbances. When something was wrong with the magnetic field, when radiation levels were spiking, when the upper atmosphere was being bombarded with particles, these temples would have sung with it. The stone itself would have hummed with warnings. The priests, the oracle keepers, the people who spent time in these spaces, they would have learned to read these acoustic signals the way we read seismographs today. A change in the resonance, a shift in the ambient tone. These would have indicated approaching danger. Time to go deeper underground. Time to seal the chambers. Time to wait out whatever was coming from above. This explains why so many of these underground complexes have multiple chambers at different depths. Each level might have been tuned to detect different types of threats. The upper chambers picking up atmospheric disturbances, the deeper chambers monitoring seismic activity, the deepest spaces perhaps resonating with changes in the Earth's magnetic field itself. And all of it built in stone, because stone remembers. Stone holds its shape across millennia. Wood rots, metal corrodes, but a precisely carved resonance chamber in limestone or granite will function the same way 10,000 years after it was built. These were not temporary shelters. They were permanent installations, designed to keep working long after their original builders were gone, passing on their warnings to whatever civilizations came next. There is something happening beneath your feet right now. An electrical current, faint but constant, pulsing through the rock itself. Most people have no idea this is even possible. We think of stone as dead, inert, just sitting there, doing nothing. But that is not quite right. Take quartz, for instance. It makes up about 12% of Earth's crust. That is a lot of quartz. And quartz has this interesting property called piezoelectricity. When you squeeze it, when you put pressure on it, not much, just a tiny voltage. But here is the thing. The quartz in Earth's crust is always under pressure. Miles of rock pressing down on it. Tectonic plates grinding against each other. The weight of mountains. All of that pressure, all the time, creating these tiny electrical pulses throughout the ground beneath us. Now, when I first learned about this, I thought it was neat. A geological curiosity. And the pattern that emerged made me set down my coffee and stare at my notes for a good 20 minutes. 89%. 89% of ancient temples, stone circles, sacred groves, and ritual sites are built directly over either quartz deposits or geological fault lines. Sometimes both. Stonehenge sits on a massive chalk bedrock that is shot through with quartz. The Great Pyramid at Giza, built on limestone that is also rich in quartz crystal. The Oracle of Delphi in Greece, positioned right on top of a major fault line where two tectonic plates meet. The temple complex at Machu Picchu, constructed on granite that is about 20% quartz by volume. You can go through the list. Angkor Wat, the temples at Malta, the megaliths of Karnak in France. The pattern holds. These sites are not just near quartz deposits or fault lines. They are directly on top of them, positioned with a precision that seems to suggest the builders knew exactly what they were looking for. And here is where it gets interesting. Remember how quartz generates electricity when you squeeze it? Fault lines are places where rock is constantly being squeezed, constantly under stress. So you have got these ancient sites positioned at exactly the spots where Earth's natural electrical activity would be strongest. There is a researcher named Paul Devereux who spent years measuring electromagnetic readings at ancient sites across Britain. He found that many of the stone circles emit measurable magnetic fields that fluctuate with the time of day and season. Not huge variations, but consistent, repeatable patterns. The stones themselves seem to be interacting with electromagnetic currents flowing through the ground. At one site in Cornwall, a group called the Dragon Project did extensive measurements throughout the 1980s. They found that just before dawn, the stones would show a spike in electromagnetic activity. Then again at dusk, almost like the site was breathing in rhythm with the sun. Now, you could say this is all coincidence. Ancient people just happened to like building on quartz-rich bedrock. They just happened to prefer locations on fault lines. But then you look at some of the engineering choices they made, and the coincidence explanation starts to feel a bit thin. Take the Temple of Dendera in Egypt. The floor is made of sandstone. Normal enough. But the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, that floor is made of solid granite. And not just any granite. It is Aswan red granite, which has a particularly high quartz content. They hauled these massive granite blocks hundreds of miles, passing over plenty of closer stone quarries, specifically to get this quartz-rich rock for the most sacred part of the temple. At Karnak in France, where you have those rows and rows of standing stones stretching for miles, researchers have found that many of the stones are positioned to create a kind of grid. The spacing is not random, there is a pattern to it, and when you map the electromagnetic readings across the site, you find that this grid corresponds to variations in the local magnetic field. The stones are positioned at the nodes, the points where the field strength changes. It almost looks like they were mapping something. Like they were building a physical representation of invisible currents flowing through the Earth. Then there is this frequency thing. Earth has a natural electromagnetic resonance called the Schumann resonance, named after the physicist who predicted it in the 1950s. The basic frequency is 7.83 Hz. That is how many times per second the electromagnetic field oscillates in the cavity between Earth's surface and the ionosphere. 7.83 Hz. Right in the range of human alpha brainwaves, the state your brain enters when you are relaxed but alert, meditating, drifting off to sleep, that threshold between waking consciousness and something else. Some researchers have suggested that ancient people might have been more sensitive to these natural electromagnetic fields, that when they talked about thin places or sacred ground, they might have been describing locations where the Schumann resonance was particularly strong, places where the boundary between normal awareness and altered states became more permeable. I am not saying they understood the physics the way we do, but maybe they did not need to. Maybe they could just feel it, the way some people can sense an approaching thunderstorm before the sky even clouds over. the way birds navigate using magnetic fields they cannot see but somehow perceive. And if you wanted to amplify these natural currents, if you wanted to create a space where this electromagnetic activity was concentrated, what would you do? You would build with quartz-rich stone. You would position your structure on a fault line where the rock is under constant stress. You would create chambers underground where these subtle fields could accumulate. Which brings us to something really strange that happened in Mexico in 2000. Miners working 300 meters below the surface in Nica, near Chihuahua, broke through into a cave system that nobody knew existed. When they shined their lights inside, they found crystals, selenite crystals, which is a form of gypsum, another piezoelectric material. Pillars of translucent crystal bigger than telephone poles, crisscrossing through vast chambers like some kind of alien cathedral. The environment down there is brutal. 50 degrees Celsius with nearly 100% humidity. You can only survive inside for about 10 minutes before your body starts to shut down. But those crystals, they have been growing down there for who knows how long. Some estimates say 500,000 years. 500,000 years of crystals slowly forming in the dark, in the heat, deep below the surface. And here is what gets me about Nica. This is not the only cave system like this. It is just the most dramatic one we have found. Geologists estimate there are probably thousands of similar crystal caves throughout the world, buried too deep for us to stumble across by accident. Natural formations that create these massive piezoelectric structures underground. What if ancient people knew about some of these caves? What if that is part of why they went underground? There are these inexplicable shafts at some ancient sites that have puzzled archaeologists for decades. Deep vertical tunnels drilled straight down into bedrock, sometimes hundreds of feet deep. And here is the weird part. There is no evidence that anything was ever extracted from them. No mineral deposits, no ore. Nothing that would explain the incredible effort it would have taken to create them. At the Pyramid of Giza, there is a shaft that goes down over 100 meters. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, they found a tunnel system that extends 103 meters below the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent. These were not simple excavations. They show evidence of sophisticated engineering, support structures. But what purpose? One theory is that these shafts were designed to tap into underground electromagnetic currents, that they were essentially antennae reaching down into the earth, connecting surface structures to the piezoelectric activity below. If you wanted to create a space that resonated with Earth's natural frequency, you would want to go deep. You would want to get below the noise of the surface, down to where the signal is clearer. And you would want to use materials that could conduct or amplify these subtle electromagnetic fields. It sounds far-fetched until you start looking at modern technology. We use quartz crystals in watches because they vibrate at precise frequencies when you run electricity through them. We use them in radios, computers, sonar. The whole modern electronics industry is built on our ability to use crystals to generate, control, and detect electromagnetic signals. Ancient people did not have the same theoretical framework we do. They did not have Maxwell's equations or quantum mechanics. But maybe they did not need them. Maybe they had something else. Direct observation over thousands of years. Trial and error. A sensitivity to these natural phenomena that we have largely lost in our electrically noisy modern world. There is this idea in geology called telluric currents. These are electric currents that flow naturally through the ground, driven by magnetic field variations. They are not constant. They fluctuate with solar activity, with the time of day, with seasonal changes, and they tend to follow paths of least resistance, which often means fault lines and areas with high mineral conductivity. If you map telluric currents across a landscape and then overlay the locations of ancient sacred sites, you get a correspondence that is hard to dismiss as pure coincidence. It is like there was this invisible grid, this network of natural electromagnetic pathways running through the earth. And ancient people built their most important structures at the intersections, the nodes where multiple currents met, where the signal was strongest, and maybe, just maybe, they built underground because that is where you could actually interface with this network, where you could tune into these planetary frequencies without the interference of surface conditions, where you could create spaces that hummed at the same frequency as Earth itself. The more I think about this, the more it feels like we have been looking at ancient underground sites all wrong. But what if they were something more sophisticated than that? What if they were designed to put people in resonance with fundamental frequencies of the planet itself? Human beings are electrical creatures. Our neurons fire using electrical impulses. Our hearts maintain rhythm through electrical signals. When you are deep underground, surrounded by quartz-rich stone, positioned on a fault line where telluric currents flow, you are essentially sitting inside a natural electromagnetic environment that your body might be able to tune into. That 7.83 Hz Schumann resonance? It is not just coincidentally similar to alpha brainwaves. Some researchers think human brains might have evolved to synchronize with that frequency, that it might be part of why we feel calm near moving water or in forests, places where the Schumann resonance is particularly strong. So what happens when you take that natural resonance and amplify it? When you concentrate it in an underground chamber lined with piezoelectric crystal, when you position yourself at a node in Earth's electromagnetic grid, I do not know. But I think maybe ancient people did. You know, there is something deeply human about the idea that we are living on top of something, that beneath the ground we walk on every day, there might be entire worlds we know nothing about. It is one of those concepts that refuses to die, no matter how much science we throw at it. And honestly, when you start looking at what we have actually discovered underground in the past couple decades, you start to understand why these ideas persist. The Hollow Earth hypothesis, in its classic form, is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. The idea that Earth is not solid all the way through, but instead contains massive voids, possibly even entire civilizations living in vast underground chambers. Now, I am not going to sit here and tell you that there is a miniature sun at the center of the planet, or that you can sail to the inner world through holes at the poles. Those versions of the theory do not hold up, but here is where it gets interesting. When you strip away the more fantastical elements, when you look at what seismology and modern cave exploration have actually revealed, there is enough real weirdness down there to make you think twice. Let me walk you through some of the legitimate science first, because it is honestly stranger than most fiction. Seismologists, the people who study earthquakes and how vibrations move through Earth, have been mapping the planet's interior for decades now. They send shockwaves through the ground and measure how those waves travel, kind of like doing an ultrasound on the planet. And what they found at certain depths is genuinely unexpected. There are these zones deep in Earth's mantle at around 410 kilometers down, and again at 660 kilometers. For a long time, scientists thought they understood what was happening at those depths. Just hot rock, immense pressure, the usual stuff. But then, in 2014, a researcher named Stephen Jacobson published findings that changed the picture entirely. Those transition zones contain water. Not liquid water like you drink from a tap, but water molecules locked inside the crystal structure of minerals. And we are not talking about a little bit of water. The amount of water potentially stored in these deep mantle zones could be equivalent to several times the volume of all Earth's oceans combined. Think about that for a second. There is more water inside Earth than on the surface. It is trapped in rock. Sure, but it is there. And where there is water, even in these extreme conditions, you start having to ask different questions about what else might be possible down there. Now let me tell you about Son Doong Cave, because this discovery really puts things in perspective. In 2009, a team of British cave explorers followed a local Vietnamese man named Ho Khan into the jungle. He had found the entrance to this cave decades earlier, but lost track of it. When they finally relocated it and went inside, they found something that redefined what we thought was possible in terms of underground spaces. Son Doong has chambers that are 200 meters tall. That is a 40-story building. Some passages are 5 kilometers long, and inside, there is an entire ecosystem, an underground river, places where the ceiling collapsed thousands of years ago, letting in sunlight. And now, there are trees growing inside the cave. Full-sized trees. In one section, the chamber is so large it has its own weather system. Clouds form near the ceiling. This cave was under our feet the entire time. Nobody knew it existed. And here is the thing that keeps me up at night sometimes. Son Doong was discovered by accident. A guy literally stumbled across the entrance. So the question is not whether there are other massive cave systems we have not found yet. The question is how many. Some mathematicians have tried to model this. They look at the distribution of known caves, the types of rock formations that allow for large voids, the way water carves through limestone and other soluble rocks over millions of years. Their estimates suggest that Earth could contain cave systems with a combined volume equivalent to the entire planet Mars. Now, that does not mean there is a Mars-sized hollow space inside Earth. It means that if you added up all the potential cave chambers, passages, and voids distributed throughout the crust, you might end up with that much empty space total. Most of it would be small, cracks and fissures and little pockets. But some of it, as we have seen with Son Doong, can be absolutely enormous. And most of it, we have never seen. Antarctica is another place where things get interesting. In 2020, scientists using ice-penetrating radar discovered liquid water lakes beneath the ice sheet, 4 kilometers down. That is almost 2.5 miles of ice on top. These are not small puddles either. Lake Vostok, the largest of these subglacial lakes, is roughly the size of Lake Ontario. It has been sealed off from the surface for potentially 15 million years. When they drilled down and took samples, they found bacterial life. Organisms that have been evolving in complete isolation, in total darkness, under crushing pressure, for longer than modern humans have existed as a species. These are functioning ecosystems that developed entirely independently from the surface world. The implications are a bit overwhelming when you sit with them. If life can thrive in those conditions, in isolation, for millions of years, what might be living in the deep caves of South America that we have not discovered yet? What might exist in the unexplored cave systems beneath the Sahara, or under the Australian outback, or deep in the crust beneath the ocean floor? This is where the legitimate science starts bumping up against the old myths, and you can see why those myths developed in the first place. People have been telling stories about underground realms for as long as we have records. Agartha, Shambhala, various underworld kingdoms. These stories show up independently in more than 40 different cultures around the world. The details differ, but the basic concept is remarkably consistent. There are places beneath the surface where beings live. Sometimes gods, sometimes advanced civilizations, sometimes just different kinds of people. The thing about myths is that they are not usually pulled out of thin air. They often reflect real observations, real experiences, filtered through the understanding and language available at the time. When ancient people found enormous cave entrances, when they ventured into the dark and found passages that seemed to go on forever, when they encountered underground rivers and vast chambers, they did not have geology or speleology to explain it. They had mythology. So did they invent these stories? Or did they encounter something real and describe it the best way they could? Now, I want to be clear about something. The Earth is not hollow in the way that early hollow Earth proponents imagined. We know that from seismology. When earthquakes happen, they send different types of waves through the planet. Some waves can travel through solid rock but not through liquid. Others behave differently depending on density. By measuring how these waves move, scientists have mapped Earth's interior with reasonable accuracy. There is a solid inner core, a liquid outer core, a mostly solid mantle, and then the crust we live on. But, and this is important, mostly solid does not mean entirely solid. The mantle transition zones with their water content, that is real. The massive cave systems in the crust, those are real. The subglacial lakes, the isolated ecosystems, the underground rivers and chambers the size of cathedrals, all real. The question is not whether there are vast underground spaces. The question is what those spaces contain and how many of them remain undiscovered. There are areas of Earth where we legitimately have no idea what is underground. The deep Amazon rainforest, for instance. We have barely scratched the surface, literally, of what cave systems might exist beneath that jungle. The Sahara Desert, before it was a desert, was a lush, wet region with rivers and lakes. Those rivers carved through rock for millions of years before the climate changed. Where did all that water go? Some of it is still down there. In aquifers and underground systems, we are only beginning to map. Central Asia, the Himalayas, these are places where legends of Shambhala and other hidden kingdoms originate. They are also places with incredibly complex geology, massive mountain ranges created by tectonic collision, the kind of geology that creates extensive cave networks. Have we explored those systems thoroughly? Not even close. I think what bothers me most about the dismissal of Hollow Earth theories is that it sometimes leads to dismissing the very real mystery of what actually exists underground. Yes, there is no miniature sun at the center of Earth. Yes, you cannot sail to an inner world through polar openings. But dismissing those specific claims should not mean dismissing the broader question of what vast, unexplored spaces might exist in the crust and upper mantle. We have explored more of the surface of Mars than we have explored the cave systems of Earth. We have better maps of the moon than we have of some cave networks right here on our own planet. That should tell you something about how much we do not know. And here is something else to consider. The deepest hole ever drilled by humans is the Kola Superdeep borehole in Russia. They drilled for 24 years and reached a depth of about 12 kilometers. That is it, 12 kilometers into a planet that has a radius of over 6,000 kilometers. We have barely scratched the surface, and even at that shallow depth, they found things they did not expect. Higher temperatures than models predicted, water at depths where there should not be any water. Rock that was saturated with hydrogen. Every time we dig deeper, every time we explore further into cave systems, every time we send instruments down to measure what is actually there, we find surprises. The underground world is not what we thought it was. It is weirder, more complex, more active, and more full of life than our models suggested. So when people talk about Hollow Earth theories, I think the right response is not to just laugh and move on. The right response is to acknowledge that the specific claim of a completely hollow planet does not match the data, but then to turn around and look at what the data actually shows, because what the data shows is remarkable enough on its own. Massive water reserves in the mantle, cave systems the size of cities, isolated ecosystems that have been cut off from the surface for millions of years, entire lakes hidden under miles of ice, underground rivers, underground weather systems, underground forests growing in collapsed cave chambers. The earth beneath our feet is not solid rock all the way down. It is a Swiss cheese of voids and chambers and passages, most of which we have never seen and probably never will see. And in some of those spaces, life has found a way to exist, to thrive, completely independent of the sun. Maybe the gods never lived on the surface, not because the surface was inherently hostile, but because underground was better, more stable, more protected, more mysterious. If you wanted to remain hidden, to be separate from the chaos and violence and constant change of the surface world, going deep would make sense. And based on what we are discovering, there would be plenty of room down there. There is this symbol that shows up everywhere. I mean everywhere. From the American Southwest to Australia, from northern Scandinavia to southern Africa. It looks like a stick figure with its arms raised, sometimes with circles at the joints, sometimes with elaborate headdresses or radiating patterns around the head. Archaeologists call it the Squatter Man, and for the longest time, nobody could explain why cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years would all draw the exact same thing. Then in 2003, a plasma physicist named Anthony Peratt was doing something completely unrelated. He was studying high-energy plasma discharge patterns in laboratory conditions, trying to understand fusion reactions. And he noticed something strange. When plasma forms in certain configurations, especially in the presence of magnetic fields, it creates these incredibly specific shapes, toroids, columns, and sometimes, under very particular conditions, it forms something that looks exactly like a human figure with raised arms. He started comparing his lab results to the archaeological record, and what he found was unsettling in the best possible way. 90% of the petroglyphs he analysed matched the plasma formations he was creating in the lab. Not kind of matched, exactly matched. The proportions, the ratios, the specific details of how the arms connected to the body, how the head radiated energy. All of it corresponded to naturally occurring plasma discharge patterns. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but why would ancient people be drawing plasma formations? They did not have laboratories. They were not studying fusion. And that is the question that opens up this entire line of thinking. What if they were not studying plasma? What if they were witnessing it? We know the sun is not always calm. Sometimes it erupts. In 1859, something called the Carrington Event happened. A massive solar storm hit Earth's magnetosphere so hard that auroras were visible at the equator. In Cuba, telegraph systems caught fire. Operators got electrical shocks just from touching the equipment. And this was not some ancient mystery. This was documented, measured, understood by scientists at the time. But here is the thing. The Carrington Event was not even close to the strongest solar storm Earth has experienced. Tree ring data, something called dendrochronology, shows chemical signatures from cosmic ray bombardment. And in the year 774 AD, something happened that makes the Carrington Event look gentle. The cosmic ray spike in those tree rings suggests a solar storm roughly 80 times more powerful. There is another one in 993 AD. Same magnitude. And these are just the ones we can measure from the last 1500 years. Go back further. Go back to when humans were painting on cave walls and carving symbols into stone. How many of these events did they witness? And more importantly, what would they have looked like? 247 cultures around the world have myths about animated figures in the sky. Not stars, not constellations that stay still, but moving, dancing, fighting figures that appeared during what they described as times of great disturbance. The Norse called them the Einherjar, warriors fighting in the sky. Aboriginal Australians saw them as ancestral spirits performing ceremonies overhead. For the longest time, we assumed these were all just different cultural interpretations of the aurora borealis. Pretty lights in the sky, explained through the lens of local belief systems. But auroras do not usually appear as distinct humanoid figures. They wave, they shimmer, they flow like curtains or ribbons. They do not look like people with raised arms standing in specific geometric patterns, unless something else is happening. Unless the plasma discharge is strong enough, concentrated enough, and if the solar storm is powerful enough, if the magnetosphere is being hit hard enough, these formations would not just appear at the poles, they would appear everywhere. Overhead, visible from equator to ice cap. Imagine you are living 3,000 years ago. The sun sets, and instead of darkness, the entire sky begins to glow. Not softly, not like distant auroras, but bright enough to read by, bright enough to cast shadows. And in that glow, figures begin to form. Massive, towering shapes that stretch from horizon to horizon. They move, they shift, they interact with each other in ways that seem almost intentional. And this goes on for hours, maybe days. You would think you were seeing gods. Of course you would. What else could beings that large, that bright, that powerful possibly be? And you would try to record what you saw. You would carve it into stone. You would paint it on cave walls. You would tell your children and your children's children about the night the sky beings came. Now here is where it connects to everything we have been talking about. If these plasma events were happening regularly enough to be recorded by cultures all over the world, that means Earth's magnetosphere was being bombarded regularly enough to create them, which means the surface was not safe, not reliably, not for extended periods. And if you are an advanced intelligence, maybe human, maybe something else, and you are trying to build a civilization, trying to preserve knowledge, trying to survive, you have two choices. You can stay on the surface and hope the next big storm does not fry your biology and wipe out your infrastructure. Or you can go underground, deep enough that rock and earth shield you from the plasma and the radiation and the electromagnetic chaos happening overhead. The mythology makes more sense from this perspective. The gods did not abandon the surface because they were being petty or because humans disappointed them. They left because the surface became uninhabitable, because the sky itself was hostile, and the memories of what used to appear in that sky, the plasma figures, the animated forms, the towering presences, those memories became the pantheons. Thor wielding electrical power, Shiva's cosmic dance, Ra emerging from the celestial waters. These were not metaphors, they were descriptions. descriptions of atmospheric plasma phenomena so intense that they seared themselves into collective human memory and stayed there for thousands of years. And consider this: if you knew these events were cyclical, if you had records or technology, or just generational observation that told you the sky was going to become dangerous again, you would not build your important structures on the surface. You would build them underground. And if you needed to mark where those underground structures were, you would use symbols. Symbols that meant something. Symbols that pointed to the reason you went underground in the first place. The squatter man, repeated across continents, might not just be a record of what people saw. A directional sign that says, remember what happened when these figures appeared. Remember where we went to survive. Remember that the surface is not always safe. The plasma connection explains something else too. It explains why so many ancient myths describe a time when the sky was different, when gods walked among humans, when the heavens were close enough to touch. Maybe that is not poetic language. Maybe that is literal description. When plasma discharges are strong enough, they can extend down toward the Earth's surface, creating visible columns of ionized air. To someone watching, it would look exactly like the sky descending, like heaven reaching down. And when it stopped, when whatever solar cycle or cosmic condition was causing these intense plasma events finally shifted, the gods would have appeared to withdraw, to ascend back into the unreachable sky, not because they chose to, but because the phenomenon creating their visible presence simply ended. The sky went back to being empty, dark, distant, but the memory stayed. The memory of when gods were visible, when the heavens were alive with movement and light and presences too vast to comprehend. And that memory shaped everything that came after. Every temple built, every ritual performed, every story told around every fire. We think of mythology as fantasy. But what if it is geology? What if it is astrophysics? What if every ancient culture was recording the same events, the same phenomena, just through the lens of their particular language and understanding? The plasma formations are real. The lab work proves they are real. The only question is whether humans witnessed them at scales large enough to build entire belief systems around. And if they did, if the sky really was that active, that dangerous, that alive, then going underground was not about hiding from enemies or protecting treasure. It was about surviving the sky itself, about waiting out the storms, about building a civilization deep enough that when the plasma came again, when the gods returned to walk above, you would be safe beneath their feet. Here is something that keeps me up at night. And I mean this literally. We have spent thousands of years walking over the surface of this planet, building cities, mapping continents, charting every mountain range and river valley, and we thought we knew what was down there. We thought we had a pretty good handle on human history, on where people built things, on what ancient civilizations looked like. Then we pointed some new technology at the ground, and everything we thought we knew just shifted. I am talking about the last 5 years specifically. The acceleration of what we are finding is almost overwhelming. It is not that the technology itself is particularly new. Ground-penetrating radar has been around since the 70s. LiDAR has been mapping forests and landscapes since the early 2000s. But the combination of these technologies, the way we are using them now, the sheer scale at which we can deploy them, that is what changed everything. Take Egypt, for instance. In 2024, a team using LiDAR satellite imaging did a comprehensive survey of the areas around the known pyramid sites. They were looking for variations in the sand, subtle differences in how light reflects off the surface that might indicate something beneath. What they found was 17 pyramids. 17, not small ones either. These are structures that would have been major construction projects, requiring thousands of workers, decades of labor, and we just did not know they were there because they are buried under sand and time. But here is the part that connects to everything we have been talking about. Every single one of those 17 pyramids, when they started doing follow-up scans, showed evidence of underground chambers, not just burial chambers, which you would expect. We are talking about networks, tunnel systems, spaces carved into the bedrock beneath the structures themselves. One of them, and they have not released the exact location yet for security reasons, shows a chamber system that extends down at least 40 meters. That is deeper than a 12-story building is tall. The thing is, this pattern keeps showing up. Guatemala, right? The Maya civilization. We thought we had a pretty good map of their major cities because, well, we could see the big pyramids poking through the jungle canopy. Then, in 2018 and 2019, they did LiDAR surveys of huge swaths of the Guatemalan jungle. The lasers can penetrate the tree cover, bounce off the ground, and create these incredibly detailed topographical maps. What they found was 60,000 structures. 60,000. Roads, buildings, agricultural terraces, defensive walls. The Maya civilization was about 4 times larger than we thought it was. But again, same pattern. About 40% of those newly discovered structures include subterranean elements, underground chambers, tunnel networks, spaces carved into limestone bedrock. Some of these tunnel systems connect structures that are kilometers apart. And the interesting thing is, a lot of these underground spaces were not for burial. The archaeological evidence suggests they were active spaces, places people went regularly, places that served some kind of function in daily life. China is even more striking because the government has been really open about this in recent years. They have been doing systematic ground-penetrating radar surveys of known historical sites, and the scale of what they are finding is almost incomprehensible. There are over 400 emperor tomb complexes that they know about, that historical records mention, that are just sitting there unexplored. I mean, most of them have never been excavated at all. They are sealed, underground, and the radar surveys show that many of them are far more extensive than anyone imagined. The first emperor's tomb, the one with the terracotta warriors, we have only excavated a tiny fraction of that complex. The main burial chamber is still sealed, but the radar shows it is part of a network that covers almost 40 square miles. 40 square miles of underground structures, tunnels, chambers, spaces we cannot even begin to identify from the surface. And that is just one tomb complex. There are hundreds more, some of them potentially even larger. What gets interesting is when you start looking at the patterns across all these discoveries. These are not isolated findings. This is a global phenomenon. Every major ancient civilization we are looking at with these new technologies, we are finding the same thing. Massive underground components that we never knew existed. Antarctica is where things get really strange. And I want to be careful here because the data is still preliminary and there is a lot we do not understand. But since 2020, there have been a series of gravitational anomaly surveys done over parts of the Antarctic ice sheet. They are not looking for buried structures specifically. They are trying to understand the geology beneath the ice, mapping the bedrock, understanding ice sheet stability for climate research. But several of these surveys have found patterns that do not quite fit natural geological formations. Straight lines, right angles, geometric arrangements that look artificial. The problem is, these patterns are beneath 2 kilometers of ice. That ice has been there for millions of years. Or so we thought. To have artificial structures beneath it would require completely rethinking our timeline of human civilization, or questioning whether the structures are human at all. So the official position is that these are probably unusual geological formations, volcanic structures, something natural that just happens to look geometric. But the researchers who are actually looking at the data, some of them are not so sure. Then there is the ocean floor, which is its own entire category of mystery. We have better maps of Mars than we do of our own ocean floor, but in the last decade, with improved sonar technology and systematic mapping projects, we keep finding these formations, over 200 of them now in the official database. They are at depths ranging from 1 kilometer to 4 kilometers down. They look artificial, straight edges, geometric patterns, structures that appear to be built, not formed by natural processes. Most of them are in the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and off the coast of Japan. That Yonaguni Formation off Japan, that is probably the most famous one, but there are dozens more. And the thing is, for these structures to have been built when sea levels were low enough for them to be above water, we are talking about end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, minimum. Some of them would require sea levels even lower than that, which pushes the timeline back even further. The academic community is really divided on this. Some researchers say we need to seriously consider that advanced civilizations existed far earlier than we thought. Others say we are seeing patterns in natural formations, that erosion and geological processes can create things that look artificial. But the debate itself is fascinating because it is forcing archaeology to grapple with physical evidence that does not fit our current models. What strikes me about all these discoveries is the sheer scale of what remains hidden. The Egyptian LiDAR surveys covered maybe 5% of areas where pyramids might be buried. The Guatemala mapping covered about a third of the Maya territory. The Chinese tomb surveys have looked at a fraction of known historical sites. Antarctica, we have mapped maybe 15% of the bedrock beneath the ice. The ocean floor, we have high-resolution mapping of less than 20%. So if this is what we are finding with limited surveys, partial coverage, early-stage technology, what is still down there? What are we walking over every single day without knowing it exists? There is this moment in archaeology right now that feels like standing on the edge of something. We are developing the tools to finally see beneath the surface, to map what has always been hidden, and what we are finding is that human history, or the history of whoever built these things, is vastly more complex than our surface-level archaeology ever suggested. The underground world was not a small part of ancient life. It was central, extensive, carefully constructed, and global in scope. And maybe that should change how we think about those old myths, those old stories about gods and advanced beings who lived beneath the earth. Maybe they were not just making things up. Maybe they were describing a world that actually existed. A world we are only now beginning to rediscover, one radar scan at a time. Here is something that bothers me when I think about it too long. We have this assumption, this deep-seated belief, that what we know about ancient civilizations represents the full picture, or at least a representative sample of it. But what if that is completely wrong? What if the knowledge we have is not just incomplete, but fundamentally skewed in a particular direction? Think about how archaeology actually works for a second. Someone finds something, right? They dig it up, they study it, they put it in a museum, but they can only find what survived, and what survives depends entirely on where it was and what it was made of. A stone temple on the surface? Sure, parts of it might still be standing after 2,000 years. A wooden structure underground? Maybe, if the conditions were perfect, but written records, organic materials, anything that needed specific preservation conditions, those are gone. Just gone. The thing is, we are not dealing with a neutral sample. We are dealing with a heavily filtered one, and the filter has a very specific bias towards surface artifacts that happen to be made of durable materials. Everything else? We have to get lucky. Consider the numbers here. Surface artifacts, the stuff that sat exposed to weather and time and human activity for millennia, survive at a rate of somewhere between 3 and 5%. That is the estimate anyway. 3 to 5%. Now think about what that means. For every stone carving, or pottery fragment, or metal tool that made it to the modern era, there were 20 or 30 others that did not. They weathered away, they broke down, they got recycled by later civilizations who needed the materials. But underground? The preservation rate jumps dramatically. Under ideal conditions, we are talking about 40 to 70% survival. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between having fragments of a story and having most of the book. So already, before we even start interpreting anything, we are working with a data set that is massively skewed towards surface remains, which means our entire understanding of ancient cultures is built primarily on what they left on top of the ground, the temples they built in the open, the monuments they wanted everyone to see. But what about everything else? What about the things they kept underground, the knowledge they stored in subsurface chambers, the rituals they performed in caves, the records they deliberately placed beneath the earth for safekeeping? Most of that is still down there, sealed, inaccessible, or it was destroyed long ago by water seepage or geological activity, or someone digging a basement in 1500 AD. Here is where it gets really interesting. We have found written records from ancient civilizations in some pretty specific contexts. 94% of ancient texts that survived until modern times were found in one of three places. dry caves on the surface, underwater where they were sealed away from oxygen, or accidentally preserved through some freak occurrence like being buried in volcanic ash or used as mummy wrapping. Notice what is missing from that list. Intentional underground libraries, subsurface record-keeping facilities, the kinds of places where you would store important knowledge if you wanted it to survive long-term and remain accessible to future generations of your own people. We know these places existed. We have found hints of them, references in the texts that did survive. The Library of Alexandria is the famous example, right? 40,000 to 400,000 scrolls, depending on which ancient source you trust, and almost all of it is gone. We have fragments, references in other works, mentions in letters, but the library itself? Destroyed, burned, probably more than once, looted, scattered. Now ask yourself this question. How much of Alexandria's actual knowledge was stored in that famous surface library? And how much might have been kept elsewhere? In private collections, in underground vaults, in satellite repositories throughout the city? We have no idea. We cannot know. Because when that library burned, we did not just lose the scrolls that were in it. We lost the catalogue. We lost the index. We lost any record of what else existed. The best estimates suggest that 90% of ancient knowledge is just gone, vanished. And we have no way of knowing what portion of that lost knowledge was specifically kept underground. We do not know if subsurface storage was common or rare. We do not know if certain types of knowledge were deliberately kept below ground, while other types were kept on the surface. We are just guessing. And here is the thing that really makes you think. We keep finding sites that were intentionally sealed, not collapsed, not accidentally buried, deliberately filled in and closed off. There are more than 60 major archaeological sites around the world where the evidence clearly shows that the original inhabitants carefully sealed underground chambers before they left. They filled in passages. They moved massive stones to block entrances. They took the time and effort to ensure that what was down there would stay down there. Why would you do that? If you were abandoning a city or a temple complex, why would you bother to seal the underground portions? It is not like you are worried about trespassers when the entire civilization is collapsing or moving on. The most logical explanation is preservation. You seal it because you want what is down there to remain intact, either for your own people to return to someday, or for whoever comes after to eventually discover. But that means we are dealing with a very particular kind of survivor bias. We know about the gods and the myths and the religious practices that were conducted on the surface because those are the ones that left visible traces. The temples, the altars, the monuments. The monuments, the temples, the monuments, those are what survived, and those are what we have built our understanding on. Meanwhile, whatever was happening underground, whatever deities or practices or knowledge systems were specifically associated with subsurface spaces, most of that is still hidden, and the parts that were not sealed or that did not survive, we have no record of at all. They are just absent from our understanding of these cultures. Think about oral traditions for a moment. For the longest time, Western archaeology had this habit of dismissing oral traditions as mythology, as made-up stories that could not be trusted as historical sources. Then we started finding the places described in those stories. We found Troy. We found the cities mentioned in the Mahabharata. We found Aboriginal sites in Australia that lined up perfectly with stories that had been passed down for 10,000 years or more. And increasingly, we are finding underground dwelling places that match perfectly with myths about gods and ancestors who lived beneath the earth. The Hopi emergence myths, the Greek stories of Hades and the underworld, the Norse tales of dwarves in the mountains. These were all dismissed as fantasy until we started discovering that, actually, a lot of ancient peoples did live underground, at least part of the time. They maintained them for generations. They had entire aspects of their culture that took place below ground. So what else are we missing? What other oral traditions have we dismissed because they talked about underground civilizations or subsurface gods or knowledge kept in the depths of the earth? How much of what we think we know about ancient religions is actually just the public-facing portion? The stuff they were comfortable showing to outsiders or performing in the open air? There is this uncomfortable possibility that sits at the center of all this. What if the gods we know about the ones with the big temples and the famous myths and the recognizable names? What if they were never the most important ones? What if they were just the public gods? The ones you prayed to when you wanted rain or victory in battle or a good harvest? And the real knowledge, the deeper understanding, the actual connection to whatever these civilizations believed about the nature of reality. What if all of that was kept underground, reserved for initiates, for people who had proven themselves, for knowledge that was too important or too dangerous to leave sitting out in the open where anyone could access it? We would never know. Or at least, we would not know until we found those sealed chambers and figured out how to open them without destroying what is inside. And even then, we would only know what happened to survive in those specific locations. Everything else would still be lost. This is what survivor bias looks like on a civilizational scale. We are not working with a representative sample of ancient knowledge. We are working with the fragments that happen to be in the right place, made of the right materials, stored in the right conditions to make it to the present day. And that sample is overwhelmingly biased towards surface remains, toward public monuments, toward the aspects of these cultures that were meant to be seen, the underground gods, the subsurface knowledge, the practices and beliefs and understandings that were kept below ground. Most of that is still down there somewhere, sealed away, waiting. Or it is gone entirely, lost to time and water and the slow grinding away of geological processes. Either way, we are telling the story of ancient civilizations based on what survived above ground. And that might be a very incomplete picture indeed. You know what strikes me about all of this? We have spent so much time trying to figure out why ancient people went underground, looking for exotic explanations, searching for lost technologies or alien influences or bizarre cosmic events. But maybe the answer is simpler than we think. Maybe it is the same reason you lock your front door at night, the same reason you put your valuables in a safe, the same reason we hide things that matter. Protection, not just from the weather, though that is part of it, not just from enemies, though that is part of it too, but protection in a deeper sense, protection of what was sacred, what was essential, what could not be allowed to disappear. Think about what happens on the surface of this planet. Wind and rain wear down stone monuments in just a few centuries. Earthquakes topple buildings. Fires consume libraries. Floods erase entire settlements. The surface is constantly changing, constantly destroying, constantly erasing the record of what came before. But underground is different. There is this stability that exists beneath the earth that we almost never think about. While the surface swings from freezing winter nights to scorching summer days, the temperature 10 feet underground barely changes at all. Year-round, in most places, it hovers right around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. That is about 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Comfortable, stable, the kind of environment where things can last, and they do last. The paintings in Lascaux Cave, sealed away from sunlight and weather, stayed vibrant for 17,000 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden in desert caves, survived 2 millennia when documents stored in buildings crumbled to dust. The artifacts in Derinkuyu, protected by meters of stone, look like they were placed there yesterday instead of thousands of years ago. There is something else, too. Something about moisture. Underground environments, when they are properly sealed, maintain consistent humidity levels. Not too dry, which makes organic materials crack and crumble. Not too wet, which promotes decay. Just right in the middle. In that Goldilocks zone, where preservation happens almost automatically. Modern archivists know this. It is why seed vaults get buried in mountains. Why genetic repositories go deep underground. Why the most important digital records, the backup servers that hold the sum of human knowledge, get tucked away in climate-controlled caverns. We are doing the exact same thing our ancestors did, and we are doing it for the exact same reasons. But physical protection is only part of the story. There is this other element that shows up in the archaeological record, again and again, across completely different cultures. The idea of underground as sacred space, as a place set apart, as somewhere that ordinary people could not just wander into whenever they felt like it. You see it in the entrance requirements. The Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece required months of preparation before initiates could enter the underground chambers. The kivas of the ancestral Puebloans had specific entry rituals, specific times when access was permitted, specific people who could and could not enter. The catacombs beneath Rome were not just burial places, they were sanctuaries, places where early Christians could gather beyond the reach of persecution. And here is what is interesting. There is not a single recorded instance, not one, of an underground temple being successfully raided during ancient warfare. Think about that for a second. Armies would sweep through regions, conquering cities, burning surface temples to the ground, stealing everything that was not nailed down. But the underground sites? They stayed hidden, they stayed protected. Even when invaders knew they existed, finding and accessing them was nearly impossible. Part of it was simply physical difficulty. You cannot just storm into a cave system the way you storm a walled city. Narrow passages become choke points. Darkness becomes a weapon for defenders who know the layout. The underground became, in essence, unhackable. But there was also something else going on. A psychological element. A sense that going underground was crossing a boundary. You see this in the symbolism that surrounds underground sites across cultures, death and rebirth. That theme shows up in 127 different cultural traditions. The idea that to go underground is to die to the surface world, and to emerge is to be reborn as something different, something changed. The cave as womb, the descent as necessary journey, the return as transformation. It is not just metaphor, though. Something actually happens to human consciousness when you remove external stimuli. Total darkness does things to your brain. Complete silence, the kind you only get deep underground, away from wind and animals and human noise, that changes how you think. Sensory deprivation studies, the scientific ones done in controlled environments, show that after about 15 to 20 minutes in total darkness and silence, people start having vivid mental experiences, visions, auditory hallucinations, a sense of presence, of being in contact with something beyond normal perception. The ancient cave painters knew this. The oracle chambers knew this. Every culture that built sacred spaces underground seemed to understand that the environment itself could induce altered states of consciousness, could open doors of perception that stayed closed in the bright noise of surface life. And maybe that was part of the protection, too. Not just protecting the space from people, but protecting the experience itself, creating conditions where transformation could happen, where normal consciousness could shift, where whatever it was they were trying to access or understand or communicate with could actually break through. There is this beautiful circularity to it. You go underground to protect what is sacred, but the act of going underground, of entering that dark, the protection is the revelation. Modern meditation retreats understand this. Silent monasteries, with their thick stone walls and minimal stimulation, isolation chambers, where people pay money to float in darkness and experience what their minds do without input. We keep rediscovering what the ancient world knew, this fundamental truth about consciousness and environment, and the spaces we need to create for certain kinds of experiences to be possible. And you can feel it. If you have ever been deep in a cave, that shift that happens, how the surface world starts to feel distant, almost unreal, how time changes down there, how your breathing slows, your heartbeat quiets, your mind settles into patterns it never quite achieves in the chaos of normal life. That is protection too. Protection from distraction, from the constant demands and noise and stimulus of surface existence. Creation of space, literal physical space, where something else becomes possible. The psychology of it makes sense. We protect what we value by putting barriers around it. Physical barriers, like the tons of stone above an underground chamber. Social barriers, like the initiation requirements and secret knowledge needed to access sacred sites. And experiential barriers, like the journey through darkness and silence that changes who you are before you reach the deepest chambers. Layer upon layer of protection. And at the center, whatever they deemed most essential, most worth preserving, most worthy of all that effort and intention and care. Sometimes it was knowledge, written records, astronomical calculations, mathematical principles. Sometimes it was genetic material, seeds and grains stored for lean times. Sometimes it was spiritual experience, the practices and rituals that connected people to whatever they understood as divine. Sometimes it was community, the gathering of people who needed to be beyond the reach of forces that would destroy them. But always, there was this understanding that the surface was temporary, vulnerable, exposed, that what mattered needed to be deeper, needed to be hidden, needed to be protected from time and weather and conquest and change. And maybe they were right. Maybe they understood something we are only just beginning to remember. That preservation requires intention. That sacredness requires boundaries. That some things, the things that really matter, they need to be sheltered from the harsh light and chaos of everyday existence. We are building our own underground archives now. Svalbard, with its seed vault buried in Arctic permafrost. The memory of the world, digital backups hidden in old mines, genetic libraries preserved in liquid nitrogen beneath the earth. The same instinct, thousands of years later. The same recognition that what we cannot afford to lose needs to be protected in the most permanent way we know. And perhaps that is the real answer to why the gods never lived on the surface. Not because they could not, but because what was most sacred, most essential, most worth preserving needed to be somewhere safer than the exposed skin of the world, needed to be somewhere that time moved more slowly, where change came gently, deep in the earth, where things last, where darkness protects instead of threatens, where silence holds space for transformation, where what matters most can be kept safe. There is something that happens to your brain when you go deep underground. Something most people never get the chance to experience. Not just the obvious things like darkness or quiet, but something more fundamental. Something that changes the way your neurons fire, the way your consciousness itself operates. And the more I learn about it, the more I wonder if the ancients knew this. If they were deliberately seeking out these spaces, not just to hide from gods or cosmic events, but because these places did something to the human mind that nothing else could replicate. Let me tell you about a study done in 2008 at a cave in France. Researchers brought volunteers deep into this limestone cave system. No special equipment, no fancy technology, just people sitting in the darkness. After about 4 hours, 90% of them started reporting hallucinations. Visual patterns, voices, presences in the darkness. Now, these were not people with any history of mental illness, not people on any kind of drugs, just ordinary folks sitting quietly in a cave. 4 hours, and their brains started manufacturing experiences that felt absolutely real. The researchers measured everything they could think of: temperature, humidity, air composition, electromagnetic fields, and what they found was that these caves have about 70% less ambient electromagnetic radiation than the surface. All that noise our brains are constantly filtering out up here, all those radio waves and electrical fields and everything modern life throws at us, it just stops down there. The rock itself acts as a shield, and when you remove all that background noise, when you strip away all those signals our nervous system is constantly processing without us even knowing it, your brain, it turns out, does not like silence. Not real silence. It expects input, constant streams of data from your senses. And when that input drops below a certain threshold, it starts creating its own, filling in the gaps, manufacturing experiences to make sense of the void. And in these deep underground spaces, where the electromagnetic fields drop to almost nothing, where the darkness is absolute and the silence is profound, your brain goes into overtime trying to process an environment it was never designed for. There is this other factor too, something about oxygen levels. In caves, especially deep ones or high-altitude locations, the oxygen content drops, not enough to be dangerous, usually, but enough to affect brain chemistry. Hypoxia, even mild hypoxia, does interesting things to consciousness. It increases the production of certain neurotransmitters, creates effects similar to what people report from DMT experiences. That sense of presence, of encountering something other, of accessing realities beyond normal perception. And here is where it gets really interesting. About 83% of ancient cave art is located in sections of caves that have unique acoustic properties and electromagnetic anomalies. Not the most accessible areas, not the places where people would have naturally gathered for shelter or safety. Specific chambers, often requiring difficult climbs or crawls to reach, where the rock composition creates particular resonance patterns and where the electromagnetic properties differ from surrounding areas. The pineal gland, this tiny structure deep in your brain, it is exquisitely sensitive to magnetic fields. Studies have shown that disruption or reduction of geomagnetic fields affects its production of melatonin and possibly DMT. And this gland, the ancients called it the seat of the soul, the third eye, the point of connection between physical and spiritual realities. Maybe they had figured out through direct experience that something about deep places, about caves and underground chambers, activated this part of the brain in ways that surface life never could. I think about those ancient priests and mystics, descending into their underground temples, spending days or weeks in those spaces. Modern sensory deprivation research suggests that extended time in darkness and silence produces profound alterations in consciousness. Time perception breaks down. The boundary between self and environment becomes fluid. People report encounters with entities, reception of knowledge, visions of past and future events. And you know what strikes me? Every major religious tradition has these stories of revelation happening in caves or on mountaintops. Moses on Sinai, Muhammad in the cave of Hira, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, which grew at the entrance to a cave, the oracle at Delphi, sitting over a chasm in the earth, breathing vapors from below. Divine contact happens in these liminal spaces, these places where the normal rules of consciousness do not quite apply. Modern neuroscience is starting to catch up with what the ancients seemed to know instinctively. When you remove electromagnetic interference, when you reduce oxygen levels slightly, when you eliminate sensory input, when you sit in perfect darkness and silence for extended periods, your brain enters states that are neurologically indistinguishable from what mystics and prophets have described for thousands of years. The visions, the voices, the sense of touching something vast and other. So maybe the underground temples were not just hiding places, maybe they were technology of a sort. Consciousness, technology, places specifically designed to facilitate states of awareness that allowed people to perceive or experience things beyond ordinary reality. Whether those experiences connected them to actual external entities or divine forces, or whether they were accessing deeper layers of their own consciousness, well, that question remains open. But the experiences themselves, those were real as anything else we experience. And sitting here now, thinking about all those ancient sites, all those chambers cut into rock, all those temples built underground or into mountainsides, I wonder what we have lost. Not just the knowledge of how to build such places, but the knowledge of why. The understanding that human consciousness is not fixed, not limited to this narrow band of awareness we call normal, that there are states of mind, ways of perceiving and being, that require specific conditions to access. Conditions that our ancestors went to extraordinary lengths to create and maintain. The silence of deep places, the darkness that goes beyond mere absence of light, the electromagnetic quiet where our thoughts can finally hear themselves. Not worship in grand surface temples, but communion in spaces where human consciousness could actually expand enough to touch something beyond itself, where the boundary between mundane and sacred, between human and divine, became thin enough to cross. You know what gets me thinking late at night? The idea that maybe, just maybe, some of the people who built these underground structures weren't building them for themselves at all. They were building them for us, or for whoever might come after whatever they thought was coming next. There is this strange quality to some of the oldest underground sites, something that doesn't quite make sense if you think they were just temples or tombs or storage facilities. They are built too well, too permanently, like someone was planning for a timeline that stretched far beyond their own civilization, beyond their children's lifetimes, beyond anything a normal person would care about. Take the granite structures in Egypt, not just the pyramids, but the underground chambers beneath them, the granite boxes in the Serapeum, the precisely cut stones in temples that most tourists never see. Granite is one of the hardest stones on Earth. It doesn't weather like limestone or sandstone. Those granite structures from 4,500 years ago, they look almost the same today as they did when they were new. Geologists estimate that granite structures like that, if left undisturbed, could last 1 million years. Maybe longer. 1 million years. Think about that for a second. Modern humans have only been around for maybe 300,000 years. Recorded history goes back maybe 5,000. But these builders, they chose a material that could outlast humanity itself by a factor of 3. That is not just durable. That is almost cosmic in scope. And here is the thing that really makes you wonder. So many of these underground sites are sealed, not just closed or blocked, but genuinely sealed, with no obvious way to get back in. The Great Pyramid had no known entrance until the Caliph's men tunneled through solid limestone in the year 820. The Hypogeum in Malta was completely filled in, buried under tons of earth. The underground temples at Göbekli Tepe were deliberately buried under rubble, with what looks like considerable effort to ensure they stayed that way. If these were active religious sites, why seal them? If they were tombs, why make it so hard to reopen them for subsequent burials? Unless the point was never to reopen them at all, unless the point was to send something forward in time, protected from whatever might happen on the surface. I came across this research a few years ago about astronomical alignments in underground temples. 73% of them encode celestial cycles, but not short ones. Not the solar year or the lunar month. They encode the precession of the equinoxes, this slow wobble in Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete. The ancient Greeks called it the Great Year. The Mayans tracked it. The builders of these underground sites seemed obsessed with it. Why would you encode a cycle that long into a structure unless you expected that structure to still be there when the cycle completed? Unless you were thinking about time in a way that most of us never do, as this vast river that stretches far beyond our tiny moment in it. There is something else that bothers me in the best way. The construction of many of these sites is, for lack of a better word, overkill. The stones are fitted too precisely. The walls are thicker than they need to be. The chambers are reinforced against forces that would never naturally occur. Engineers who study these structures keep coming back to the same puzzling conclusion. They are built to withstand catastrophes that are orders of magnitude beyond what would be necessary for normal function. The underground city at Derinkuyu in Turkey could house 20,000 people and had stone doors weighing several tons that could only be closed from the inside. But the doors are so massive, so perfectly balanced, that they seem designed to protect against something far more severe than invading armies. Something that might make the surface uninhabitable for long periods of time. And then there are the symbols. This is where it gets really interesting, in a quiet, unsettling way. In 1981, the U.S. Department of Energy commissioned a study about how to mark nuclear waste disposal sites. The waste would remain dangerous for 10,000 years or more, far longer than any civilization or language we know of. How do you warn people in the year 12,000 AD not to dig here? The symbols they came up with, these universal warning markers meant to transcend language and culture, they look remarkably similar to symbols found at ancient sacred underground sites. The ray patterns, the danger symbols, the markers that say, in whatever visual language transcends time, do not disturb what lies beneath. Maybe those ancient symbols weren't just religious. Maybe they were practical. Maybe someone was trying to tell future civilizations, we put something important here. We sealed it for a reason. Respect what we did even if you don't understand why. I think about the people who built these places sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. What did they know that we don't? What were they afraid of? What were they trying to preserve? Knowledge, maybe. Seeds, genetic information, star charts, mathematical principles, or maybe just a message. We were here, we knew things, we tried to prepare for what we saw coming. The ancient Egyptians had this concept they called coming forth by day. It is usually translated as resurrection, but maybe it meant something else. Maybe it meant the day when what was sealed underground would be opened again, when the knowledge preserved in darkness would come back into the light. And maybe that time is now. Maybe all these rediscoveries we have been making in the past few decades, all these sealed chambers and buried cities and forgotten temples, maybe we are finally reaching the point in our development where we are ready to receive the message. Or maybe the real message is simpler than that. Maybe it is just this. Everything passes. Civilizations rise and fall like tides. What seems permanent crumbles, but if you build deep enough, carefully enough, with enough intention and foresight, you can reach across the centuries and touch the hands of people who won't be born for thousands of years. That is a kind of hope, isn't it? A faith in the future. Even when you know your own world might not make it, a belief that someone will come after. Someone will find what you left behind. You know what keeps me up at night sometimes? Not the question of whether catastrophes happen. We know they do. What keeps me thinking is the pattern, the way these events seem to arrive like clockwork, like some cosmic metronome ticking away in the background of Earth's history, marking time in ways we are only just beginning to understand. 12,800 years ago, something happened. The Younger Dryas event, scientists call it. And when I say something happened, I mean the world changed in the span of a human lifetime, maybe faster. Temperatures dropped 15 degrees Celsius within decades. Think about that for a moment. Not centuries, not millennia, decades, the kind of time frame where you could be born into one world and die in a completely different one. The megafauna, the giant animals that had survived the previous ice age just fine, they vanished. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, all gone. And there is this black mat layer in the geological record, this dark band of sediment filled with nanodiamonds and shocked quartz, and all these markers that suggest something came from the sky. Maybe multiple impacts, the kind of event that would make the surface of the planet a very inhospitable place to be for a while. But here is the thing, that was not unique. When you start looking at the geological record, really looking at it, you see these events happening over and over again, different scales, different causes, but the same result. The surface becoming temporarily uninhabitable, at least for complex civilization. Go back 74,000 years. Toba, a supervolcano in what is now Indonesia that erupted with a force we can barely comprehend. 6 years of volcanic winter, temperatures dropping by as much as 15 degrees again. And here is where it gets really interesting. Geneticists have found this bottleneck in human DNA. This moment where our entire species got squeezed down to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. Not 3 million, 3,000. We came that close to not making it. Where did those people go? How did they survive? Because clearly some of them did. We are here, after all. But what kind of shelters would you need to survive 6 years of volcanic winter? What kind of planning? What kind of knowledge? The geological record shows 8 major bond events in just the last 11,000 years. These are not little hiccups. Each one lasted between 100 and 200 years. 2 centuries of climate disruption. 2 centuries where growing crops on the surface would have been, at best, extremely difficult. At worst, impossible. How many smaller events are we missing? How many localized catastrophes? Forced populations to seek shelter, to adapt, to remember. And then there is the magnetic field, this invisible shield that protects us from solar radiation and cosmic rays. It flips. The North Pole becomes the South Pole. The South becomes the North. On average, this happens every 200,000 to 300,000 years. Except it has been 780,000 years since the last flip. We are, by any reasonable calculation, overdue, and during a magnetic reversal, the field weakens dramatically. For maybe 1,000 years, maybe more, we would be exposed to significantly higher levels of radiation. The surface would not be immediately lethal, but it would not be comfortable either. It would not be safe. The stories match the evidence. That is what gets me. More than 200 cultures around the world have flood myths. Not just any flood, the Great Flood, the one that changed everything. And when you date these myths, when you trace them back through linguistic evolution and cultural memory, They cluster around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, right around the Younger Dryas, right when something catastrophic happened to the surface of this planet. Coincidence? Maybe. But there is a pattern here that is hard to ignore. A rhythm to these events that suggests they are not random. Solar cycles play a role. The sun's magnetic field flips every 11 years or so, and longer cycles affect Earth's climate in ways we are still mapping. Cosmic impacts happen more regularly than we used to think. Clusters of comets or asteroids passing through the inner solar system in predictable intervals. The Earth's crust itself shifts and settles, releasing tension in earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that sometimes cascade into global events. What if ancient civilizations figured this out? Not the mechanisms necessarily. They did not need to understand plate tectonics or magnetism or orbital mechanics. They just needed to notice the pattern, to keep records across generations, to recognize that every so often, the surface becomes dangerous, unsurvivable. And when that happens, you need somewhere to go. Underground makes sense then. Not as a permanent home, not because gods naturally live below, but as a refuge, a place to wait out the storm. Deep caves maintain stable temperatures. They shield you from radiation. They protect you from ash, fall, and temperature swings and all the chaos happening on the surface. And if you know these events are coming, if your ancestors survived the last one and passed down that knowledge, you would prepare. You would build. You would make sacred the places that saved you. Maybe that is why so many ancient underground sites feel like more than just shelters. The elaborate decorations, the religious significance, the careful construction, these were not panic rooms built in desperation. They were planned refuges, insurance policies carved into bedrock, places where civilization could survive until the surface became safe again. And maybe that is why the gods in these stories are always associated with renewal, with rebirth, with coming back to the surface and starting over. Because that is exactly what these populations would have done. Emerged from below after the catastrophe passed, returned to a surface scrubbed clean by whatever had happened, started building again. The question is not whether these catastrophes happen. We know they do. The evidence is written in ice and stone, and the very genes we carry. The question is whether we remember, whether buried somewhere in our collective mythology is a warning from ancestors who survived the unsurvivable. A reminder that the surface is not always safe, that sometimes the only way to preserve what matters is to take it below. And as I think about this now, in the quiet of the night, there is something almost comforting about it. The idea that civilizations before us faced these challenges and found solutions, that humans have always been resourceful enough, clever enough, to survive. We adapt, we remember, we pass on what we learn. The cycles continue. The cosmos keeps spinning, but somewhere in the patterns of the past might be the wisdom we need for whatever comes next. There is this place in Norway, carved into a mountain on an island called Spitsbergen, about 800 miles from the North Pole. From the outside, it looks almost like something from science fiction, this concrete portal jutting out of the frozen mountainside, geometric and stark against the endless white. But inside, buried 120 meters into the permafrost, sits something that might be the most important room on Earth. They call it the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and right now, at this moment, it holds over 1,300,000 different varieties of seeds from almost every country on the planet. I think about this place a lot because when you strip away all the technical language, all the scientific justification, what humanity built there is exactly what ancient people were doing with their caves and their underground temples. We are hiding the things that matter most in the Earth itself. The vault opened in 2008, designed to withstand everything from earthquakes to nuclear war to the collapse of civilization itself. The permafrost keeps the seeds at 18 degrees below Celsius, even if the refrigeration systems fail, even if the power goes out forever. Even if everyone who knows about the vault disappears, those seeds would remain viable, protected by the same eternal cold that has preserved mammoths for tens of thousands of years. And here is the thing that gets me. We did not build this underground because it was cheaper. We did not do it because it was easier. Building anything in Arctic permafrost is a logistical nightmare. We did it because, at some deep level, modern civilization understands what ancient people understood. The surface is vulnerable. The surface changes. The surface can be destroyed. But the earth, the deep earth, endures. It is not just seeds either. In the last 2 decades, we have seen this massive shift toward underground infrastructure that nobody really talks about. Facebook operates massive data centers carved into Swedish bedrock. Google has server farms inside, converted limestone mines. Microsoft is experimenting with underwater data centers, but also with facilities built into mountains. All of our digital memory, all the accumulated knowledge of the internet age, increasingly lives not in gleaming towers reaching toward the sky, but in chambers carved into the bones of the earth. There is something almost poetic about it. We create these digital gods, these artificial intelligences and vast networks of information, and where do we house them? In the same dark places where our ancestors painted their sacred images and performed their most important rituals. The luxury survival bunker industry has become a $2.3 billion business since 2020. 400 of these things built in just a few years, buried an average of 30 meters down. Some of them are simple concrete tubes with air filtration and food storage. But others, the high-end ones, they are underground palaces, swimming pools and movie theaters and hydroponic gardens, all sealed beneath tons of earth and steel. Modern mystery cults for the extremely wealthy. Spaces where initiates retreat from a surface world they no longer trust. Cities are going underground too, but in a different way. Montreal has this whole subsurface network, over 30 kilometers of corridors connecting buildings and metro stations, creating what amounts to an underground city where people can live their entire lives without going outside. Helsinki has excavated more than 400 underground facilities, including parking garages, swimming pools, even a church carved into solid granite. Singapore, running out of surface space on its tiny island, has begun to build entire districts below ground. And these are not just storage facilities or emergency shelters. These are spaces designed for daily life, for normal human activity, just relocated beneath the surface. It is like we are slowly, almost unconsciously, beginning to reverse our assumption that human civilization belongs above ground. The Mars colonization plans make this even clearer. Every serious proposal for establishing a permanent human presence on Mars, every single one, assumes that 90% or more of the habitat will be underground. Not because we want it that way, not because underground living is more pleasant or more convenient, but because the surface of Mars, bombarded by radiation, subjected to wild temperature swings, offers no protection for fragile human bodies. To live on another world, we would have to become a subterranean species, which makes you wonder if maybe Earth's surface is more like Mars than we realize. Maybe the only reason we can live up here at all is because we have this thin bubble of atmosphere protecting us. This magnetic field deflecting solar radiation, this delicate balance of temperature and pressure that makes exposure to the sky survivable. Take those things away or weaken them enough, and suddenly the surface becomes hostile. Suddenly going underground stops being a choice and becomes a necessity. The ancient myths talk about ages when the gods lived on the surface, when divine beings walked openly among humans. And then something changed. The gods retreated. They went below or beyond or away. And I wonder if what those myths are really describing is a time when surface conditions were different, when the magnetosphere was stronger, when cosmic radiation was lower, when living, exposed to the sky, was safer than it is now. We might be living through the reversal of that process right now, watching our own civilization begin its slow retreat underground without fully understanding why. We tell ourselves stories about efficiency, about security, about maximizing space, but maybe what we are really responding to is the same ancient instinct that sent our ancestors into caves during dangerous times. The surface feels less safe than it used to, and so, bit by bit, we are preparing spaces below. You know what I love about all of this? After everything we have talked about tonight, after all these hours of exploring underground chambers and ancient mysteries and human beings choosing to build their most sacred spaces beneath the earth, we still do not have all the answers. Not even close, and there is something beautiful about that, something almost comforting in the unknown. Take the Great Pyramid, for instance. We have been studying it for centuries, crawling through every passage, measuring every stone, and then in 2017, scientists using cosmic ray imaging discovered something we never knew was there. A void, a cavity inside the pyramid roughly 30 meters long, sitting above the Grand Gallery, just waiting in the darkness. We can see it on the scans, this empty space that has been sealed since the pyramid was built 4,500 years ago. But we have no way to reach it, no way to know what it contains or why it exists. It just sits there in the heart of one of humanity's most studied structures, keeping its secrets. And that chamber in India, the one they call Door B in the Padmanabhaswamy temple, 6 other vaults have been opened, filled with treasures beyond imagination, gold and jewels accumulated over centuries. But Door B remains sealed, marked with serpent imagery and warnings that nobody quite agrees on how to interpret. The legends say it leads to underground passages that stretch for miles beneath the temple complex, connecting to other sacred sites, creating a whole hidden geography beneath the surface. But nobody knows for sure because nobody has opened it. Maybe nobody should. Then there is Antarctica, which feels almost like another planet. This vast frozen wilderness at the bottom of the world. Thermal imaging has detected hollow spaces beneath the ice, places where geothermal heat creates caverns and tunnels, spaces where the temperature might be surprisingly temperate despite the frozen wasteland above. Some researchers think there could be entire ecosystems down there, life that has been isolated for millions of years, evolving in complete darkness beneath miles of ice. But we have barely begun to explore these spaces. They remain largely unknown, largely untouched. The Bosnian Pyramid controversy continues, with some researchers claiming there is a tunnel network stretching 20 kilometers or more beneath the hills near Visoko, connecting structures they believe are ancient pyramids buried under vegetation and soil. Mainstream archaeology largely dismisses the claims, but the tunnels themselves are real, photographed, and partially explored, stretching into the darkness with nobody quite certain where they lead or who built them or when. And then there is that copper scroll they found near the Dead Sea, an artifact unlike any other among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Instead of religious texts, it contains a list, 64 locations, each one describing underground hiding places, chambers and tunnels where treasures were supposedly concealed 2,000 years ago. The scroll gives directions, measurements, quantities of gold and silver hidden away beneath the surface. But despite decades of searching, despite expeditions and excavations and countless attempts to decode the ancient directions, not a single treasure has been recovered. Either they were found long ago, removed by people whose names are lost to history, or they are still down there, waiting in chambers we have not yet learned how to find. These are just the questions we know to ask, the mysteries we have identified. But what about the ones we have not even discovered yet? The sealed chambers we have not detected, the underground complexes buried beneath cities or forests or deserts, places that might rewrite everything we think we understand about ancient civilizations and their relationship with the world beneath our feet. Every answer we find seems to generate new questions, deeper mysteries, further invitations to keep looking, keep wondering, keep exploring the spaces our ancestors carved into the living rock. And maybe that is exactly how it should be. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, at least for now. At least until we are ready to understand what they have to teach us. The earth beneath us holds countless secrets still, chambers waiting in the darkness, stories carved in stone that nobody has read in thousands of years. And somewhere, deep below the surface, in tunnels and caverns and sacred spaces we have yet to discover, the ancient world continues to keep its counsel, patient and silent, waiting for the day when we finally ask the right questions. And so we find ourselves here, at the end of this long journey through time and stone and darkness, having followed the thread of a simple question that turned out to be not so simple after all. Why did the ancients put their gods underground? Why did they carve their most sacred spaces into the belly of the earth, away from the sun and sky that we moderns assume would be the natural home of the divine? The pattern is there, undeniable once you see it. 40,000 years of consistency, from the painted caves of Europe to the carved temples of India, from the oracle chambers of Greece to the cenotes of the Maya. The surface was for the living, yes, but the sacred, the eternal, the truly important that went below. And maybe they knew something we have forgotten in our brief few centuries of steel and glass and confidence. We are starting to remember now, in our own way. The seed vault in Norway, the data centers buried in mountains, the plans for underground cities on Mars. We are moving the things that matter back below the surface, and we tell ourselves it is about temperature control or security or efficiency. But maybe it is something deeper than that, something written in the part of us that still remembers when survival meant reading the earth correctly. The gods themselves, whether they were real beings or projections of human wisdom or something in between, they understood what the surface really is. A place where the sky can turn against you, where the ground can open beneath your feet, where everything you build can be swept away by forces you cannot control. The underground is where things last, where they survive, where they wait. And here you are now, lying in the darkness of your own room, safe in this moment, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of your body against the bed, exactly where you need to be. All of human history, all of those choices made by people long gone, all of that building and carving and hiding and preserving, it led to you, here, now, in this quiet space. You do not need to solve the mystery tonight. You do not need to understand everything. It is enough to have wondered, to have followed the thread, to have let yourself imagine what those ancient people knew and felt and feared. The answers can wait. They have waited this long. Rest now. You have done enough today. The earth turns beneath you, solid and old, and somewhere deep below, in chambers carved by hands long turned to dust, the darkness holds what it has always held. And you are safe here, in your own darkness, your own quiet space, exactly where you belong. Let it all drift away now. The gods, the caves, the questions. Let them settle like dust in those ancient corridors, patient and still.